The remote village of Kraskino in the Ussuri-Krai region of Russia had seen better days by May 14, 2025. Nestled between dense taiga forests and the rolling hills that stretched toward the Chinese border, this settlement of barely 300 souls had weathered decades of economic hardship and environmental change. The village was originally established in the 1930s as a logging outpost, where generations of families carved out modest livings from the surrounding wilderness. However, recent industrial expansion and aggressive deforestation have dramatically altered the landscape that once provided sustenance and sanctuary for the region's wildlife. On this particular spring morning, the community gathered at the small outdoor cemetery behind the Orthodox chapel to bid farewell to Dmitry Volkov, an 82-year-old elder who had spent his entire life advocating for peaceful coexistence between humans and the bears that roamed the surrounding forests. Volkov was a local legend, known for his deep understanding of wildlife behavior and his passionate speeches about respecting the natural balance that had sustained human and animal populations for centuries. The funeral service was conducted beneath a canopy of white birch trees, their fresh spring leaves casting dappled shadows across the assembled mourners. Approximately 60 villagers had come to pay their respects, including Volkov's daughter Svetlana Volkova, his grandson Mikhail Volkov, and longtime friend Boris Petrov, who had worked alongside Dmitry in the logging industry before both men became environmental advocates in their later years. Father Alexei conducted the service with traditional solemnity, speaking about Volkov's legacy of wisdom and his belief that humans could learn to share their environment responsibly with the creatures that had inhabited these lands long before the first settlers arrived. The priest mentioned how Volkov had often warned that the increasing encroachment into bear territories would eventually lead to tragic consequences if sustainable practices were not adopted. Several mourners noticed unusual sounds from the forest edge approximately 50 meters from the cemetery as the service progressed. Anna Kozlova, Volkov's neighbor, later reported hearing what sounded like heavy breathing and the snapping of branches, but initially dismissed these noises as wind moving through the undergrowth. The recent logging operations had left the forest fragmented and unstable, creating an environment where wildlife was forced to venture closer to human settlements in search of food and suitable habitat. According to village teacher Yelena Morozova's watch, at precisely 2:47 p.m., a massive Russian brown bear weighing an estimated 400 kilograms burst through the tree line with shocking suddenness. The animal appeared to be an adult male, its thick brown coat matted and unkempt, suggesting it had recently emerged from hibernation in poor condition. Wildlife experts would later theorize that the bear's aggressive behavior stemmed from extreme hunger and stress caused by habitat destruction and the scarcity of traditional food sources. The bear's initial charge sent the entire gathering into immediate panic. Mourners scattered in all directions, some seeking shelter behind headstones, while others ran toward the village. However, 3 individuals could not escape the bear's devastating path of destruction. Boris Petrov, 76 years old and moving slowly due to arthritis, was the first victim. The bear struck him down near Volkov's grave site, delivering fatal injuries before he could reach safety. Witnesses reported that Petrov had been attempting to shield a young mother and her child when the attack occurred. The second victim was Galina Romanova, a 58-year-old schoolteacher who had tripped while fleeing toward the chapel. The bear turned on her as she struggled to regain her footing, and despite the frantic shouts of other mourners attempting to distract the animal, she sustained injuries that proved fatal within minutes. The third and final victim was Ivan Smirnov, a 43-year-old forest ranger who had worked closely with Volkov on wildlife conservation efforts. Ironically, Smirnov had attempted to use his professional knowledge to manage the situation by positioning himself between the bear and the remaining mourners. His heroic but futile effort cost him his life as the bear overwhelmed his defensive position. Throughout the chaotic encounter, which lasted approximately 4 minutes, surviving mourners like Mikhail Volkov and Anna Kozlova provided crucial eyewitness accounts of the bear's behavior. They described an animal that appeared desperate and disoriented rather than naturally predatory, supporting the theory that environmental pressures had driven it to this extreme aggression. The bear eventually retreated into the forest as the sound of approaching emergency vehicles filled the air. Local wildlife officers, led by Senior Ranger Oleg Petrov, arrived within 20 minutes of the initial emergency call. After evaluating the scene and tracking the bear's movements, they determined that the animal had likely been displaced from its traditional territory by recent clear-cutting operations conducted approximately 8 kilometers from the village. The tragic irony of the situation was not lost on the surviving community members. Dmitry Volkov had spent decades warning that human expansion and environmental destruction would inevitably lead to dangerous conflicts with wildlife. His funeral had become the very manifestation of his prophetic concerns about the consequences of failing to maintain respectful boundaries with nature. The incident sent shockwaves through the region and prompted immediate calls for stricter wildlife management protocols and forest conservation measures. Environmental groups cited the tragedy as evidence of the urgent need to establish protected corridors, allowing bears and other wildlife to access traditional food sources without encroaching on human settlements. Within weeks of the attack, local authorities implemented regulations requiring wildlife monitoring during outdoor gatherings and established emergency response protocols for bear encounters in populated areas. The autumn of 2017, vibrant fall foliage in a popular mountainous region of the southeastern United States drew thousands of hikers eager to witness nature's annual color display before winter set in. This ancient mountain range, spanning the border between two southern states, is home to some of North America's most diverse forest ecosystems and a stable population of American black bears. Among the many visitors that October was Thaddeus Blackwood, a 34-year-old software engineer from Charlotte who had recently rekindled a childhood passion for hiking. After completing several marked trails during the summer, Thaddeus felt confident enough to attempt what locals referred to as ridge chasing, a practice of seeking out ideal sunset vantage points that often required short detours off official paths. The day began without incident. Thaddeus arrived at the trailhead before dawn, his backpack stocked with energy snacks, water, a basic first aid kit, and a small canister of bear spray, a precaution he had rarely considered essential in the past. His plan was to follow a major trail for 6 miles before veering off toward a wooded ridge to reach a scenic outcropping he had marked on a topographic map. Officials later confirmed that Thaddeus had signed the trail register and outlined his intended route, although he had not disclosed plans to leave the designated path. By mid-afternoon, he had made good progress and entered a particularly dense section of forest to reach his chosen overlook before sunset. What Thaddeus could not have known was that he had stepped into a seasonal feeding area for a black bear. The bear, a female estimated to weigh around 250 pounds, had been foraging heavily on acorns and berries to prepare for winter hibernation. Biologists later concluded that the bear had likely made a temporary bedding site beneath a fallen oak near where Thaddeus intended to exit the woods. According to the account he later gave to authorities, Thaddeus was pushing through a thick stand of mountain laurel when he heard a sudden snort followed by movement in the leaves. Within moments, a bear charged from approximately 15 yards away. The impact knocked him backward down a small incline. Thaddeus described a sharp pain as the bear's teeth punctured his upper thigh. Instinctively, he began screaming and swinging his trekking poles, striking the bear across the face. This sudden resistance appeared to disorient the animal momentarily, allowing Thaddeus to roll into a narrow gap between two large boulders. The bear attempted to reach him but was unable to fit through the confined space. After several minutes of circling and audible huffing, the sow retreated into the brush, although Thaddeus could still hear it moving nearby for what felt like hours. Sheltered in his rocky refuge, Thaddeus Blackwood took stock of his injuries. The puncture wounds in his thigh were deep and bleeding heavily. He removed his shirt, folded it into a compress, and used his belt to hold it firmly against the wound. By then, symptoms of shock had begun to set in, and he realized his cell phone showed no signal, an all-too-common issue in the remote valleys of the region. As twilight descended over the mountains, the temperature dropped sharply, intensifying his physical distress. Believing he might not survive the night, Thaddeus retrieved his trail journal from his backpack and wrote what he thought could be his final message. He included a note to his mother, added the date, and recorded his coordinates from the GPS device before carefully placing the journal back into his pack. Help came from an unexpected source. Marianne Lefebvre, an experienced backcountry guide, had been leading a small group along a nearby trail when one of her clients reported hearing unusual sounds. Recognizing the noises as possible distress calls, Marianne followed wilderness protocol. She instructed her assistant to lead the group to their designated campsite while she went to investigate. She discovered Thaddeus shortly after 8 p.m., semi-conscious and in an advanced state of hypothermia. Marianne immediately activated her emergency beacon and provided wilderness first aid, using thermal blankets and heat packs to stabilize his core temperature. The area's emergency response team, already mobilized after Thaddeus failed to return to his vehicle by nightfall, arrived by helicopter 3 hours later. At a regional trauma center, surgeons operated for 5 hours to repair the damage to his thigh, which had narrowly missed a major artery. Medical staff confirmed that had the field compress not been applied when it was, Thaddeus would have likely succumbed to blood loss before rescue. Following an investigation, wildlife officials determined the bear had acted defensively when startled at close range. It was neither relocated nor tracked further, and the incident was classified as a rare and unfortunate wilderness encounter rather than a predatory attack. During his 3-month recovery, the message Thaddeus had written in his journal gained widespread attention among outdoor enthusiasts. His words were shared as a poignant reminder of how quickly adventure in the wild can turn perilous. The phrase he had written, his farewell to his mother, was later incorporated into public safety campaigns about the risks of venturing off established trails. Thaddeus returned to hiking the following year, but never alone again. He became a vocal advocate for wilderness safety, especially regarding behavior in bear country. In interviews, he often emphasized that the bear had not been at fault. It had been defending its space. The outcome, he maintained, stemmed from his own choice to leave the marked trail. As a result of the incident, park officials introduced new signage at trailheads, warning about the increased risk of off-trail hiking during the fall season, when bears are actively preparing for hibernation. These education efforts were credited with reducing similar incidents by nearly 40% in the following years. By 2023, the stretch of Highway 2 between a national park in northwestern Montana and Browning had become notorious among locals for its frequent wildlife crossings. This particular section of road wound through pristine wilderness areas where the Rocky Mountain ecosystem remained largely intact, creating a natural corridor that grizzly bears, elk, and other large mammals used to move between seasonal feeding grounds. The Department of Transportation had installed numerous warning signs along this route. Still, tourists and some residents continued to underestimate the dangers of close encounters with wild animals. Carla Henderson, a 34-year-old freelance photographer from Denver, Colorado, was driving this scenic route on a crisp October afternoon, hoping to capture autumn landscapes for a Nature magazine assignment. Henderson had built a modest reputation, photographing wildlife and natural scenery throughout the American West, though she specialized primarily in scenic vistas rather than close-up animal photography. Her silver Honda Civic was loaded with professional camera equipment, telephoto lenses, and camping gear for what she had planned as a week-long solo photography expedition through Montana's backcountry. The region surrounding this particular highway segment had experienced an unusually productive berry season that year, which wildlife biologists later noted had drawn an increased number of grizzly bears to areas closer to human activity. These bears followed ancient feeding patterns, moving between high-elevation huckleberry patches and lower-elevation areas where late-season salmon runs provided additional protein sources before winter hibernation. At approximately 3:20 p.m., while navigating a gradual curve near mile marker 127, Henderson spotted a large grizzly bear, approximately 30 meters from the roadside. The massive animal appeared to be an adult male, its thick autumn coat gleaming golden brown in the afternoon sunlight as it methodically stripped berries from a serviceberry bush. Henderson later told investigators that she had initially estimated the bear's weight at around 300 kilograms, making it one of the largest grizzlies she had ever encountered. Despite reading numerous safety warnings about maintaining distance from wildlife, Henderson pulled her vehicle onto the narrow shoulder and stepped outside to photograph the bear. She later explained to medical personnel that her professional instincts had overridden her common sense, and she believed the bear was sufficiently distracted by its feeding to pose no immediate threat. Henderson retrieved her camera with a 300mm telephoto lens from the back seat and began capturing images from what she considered a safe distance beside her open car door. For approximately 3 minutes, the bear continued feeding while Henderson photographed its behavior. She later described feeling increasingly confident as the animal showed no apparent awareness of her presence. However, this false sense of security proved nearly fatal when the bear suddenly raised its head and locked eyes with her. Wildlife experts later explained that grizzly bears possess exceptional hearing and were likely aware of Henderson's presence when she stopped her vehicle. The bear's apparent indifference had been misleading, as these animals often continue normal activities while assessing potential threats before deciding on a course of action. Without any warning signs that Henderson could detect, the grizzly suddenly charged directly toward her position. The bear covered the 30-meter distance with shocking speed, its powerful limbs propelling its massive frame across the uneven terrain in seconds. Henderson later recounted that she had barely enough time to register the bear's movement before it was upon her. The initial impact knocked Henderson to the ground beside her vehicle, causing her to drop her expensive camera equipment. The bear's claws raked across her left shoulder and upper back, tearing through her heavy jacket and inflicting deep lacerations that would require extensive surgical repair. Henderson's screams attracted the attention of other motorists traveling the highway, including truck driver Robert Martinez and retired teacher Susan Walsh, both of whom witnessed the attack and immediately called emergency services. In what she later described as pure survival instinct, Henderson managed to scramble into her car despite her injuries and slam the door shut just as the bear attempted to follow her inside the vehicle. The grizzly spent several terrifying minutes pawing at the car windows and doors, leaving deep scratches in the metal and causing significant damage to the vehicle's exterior. Henderson remained conscious throughout this ordeal, though she was losing considerable blood from her shoulder wounds. Martinez and Walsh had stopped their vehicles at a safe distance and were honking their horns to drive the bear away from Henderson's car. Their efforts, combined with the arrival of additional traffic, eventually prompted the grizzly to abandon its attack and retreat into the surrounding forest. Emergency medical technicians arrived within 15 minutes of the initial emergency call, followed shortly by wildlife officers from the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Henderson was conscious, but in severe shock when paramedics reached her vehicle. She had lost significant blood and required immediate treatment for multiple lacerations, puncture wounds, and potential infection from the bear's claws. A medical helicopter transported Henderson to a hospital in Great Falls, where trauma surgeons spent 4 hours repairing damage to her shoulder muscles and treating her wounds. She required multiple blood transfusions and remained hospitalized for 8 days while receiving antibiotics to prevent infection and undergoing physical therapy to restore mobility in her injured arm. The incident prompted renewed discussions about wildlife safety protocols along Montana's scenic highways. Transportation officials increased the number and visibility of warning signs, while wildlife management agencies launched an expanded public education campaign about the dangers of approaching wild animals for photographs. Henderson's experience became a cautionary tale that wildlife officials frequently cited when discussing the importance of maintaining safe distances from dangerous animals, regardless of their apparent behavior or the photographic opportunities they might present. In the summer of 2008, the remote southwestern shores of Kodiak Island, Alaska, remained one of the last truly wild coastlines in North America. Part of the sprawling Kodiak Wildlife Refuge, established in 1941, the island was home to the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world, the Kodiak bear. These massive carnivores, sometimes exceeding 1,500 pounds, roamed the island's varied terrain of mountains, meadows, and densely forested valleys, with little human interference. Percival Percy Harrington Wells had made a name for himself as one of wildlife photography's most daring and dedicated practitioners. At 46, the British-born, Seattle-based photographer had published acclaimed photo essays in prominent magazines and renowned wildlife publications. His signature approach involved immersing himself alone in wilderness areas for weeks at a time to capture intimate moments of animal behavior that few humans had ever witnessed. Percy's latest project aimed to document the feeding patterns of Kodiak bears during the summer salmon runs, specifically the subtle differences in fishing techniques employed by bears of varying ages and sexes. After securing the necessary permits from wildlife authorities, he chartered a small float plane to drop him off at a secluded cove on the island's southwestern shore, a location known for its healthy bear population, but seldom visited due to its inaccessibility. The pilot who delivered Percy to the site later recalled warning him about the unusual number of bears he had spotted during the approach flight. Percy, however, reportedly dismissed these concerns, pointing to his 20 years of experience working around large predators and the extensive safety equipment he had with him, including motion sensor cameras designed to alert him to approaching animals. For 3 days, Percy established his base camp on a small, rocky beach at the cove's edge. He set up remote cameras along a nearby salmon stream and began collecting preliminary footage. His satellite phone communications with his editor in Seattle indicated initial success, with Percy reporting he had observed at least 7 different bears utilizing the stream and surrounding area. On the 4th day, Percy decided to venture further inland to place additional cameras at locations where bears might be resting between feeding sessions. According to the data later recovered from his GPS device, he hiked approximately 3 miles up a densely wooded valley alongside the stream. The timestamps on his camera indicated he had spent several hours setting up motion-triggered equipment in a small clearing, where bear tracks and scat suggested frequent animal activity. What Percy could not have known was that he had entered the territory of a particularly large male Kodiak bear, estimated by wildlife biologists to weigh close to 1,400 pounds. The bear had recently killed a young moose calf and dragged the carcass into a thicket near the clearing where Percy was working. Evidence suggested the bear had been away from its kill temporarily, possibly forced off by wolves or another bear, and was returning when it encountered the photographer. At approximately 4:40 p.m., Percy's body-mounted camera captured the bear, observing him from the forest edge for nearly 2 minutes before making its presence known. The footage, later recovered by search and rescue personnel, showed the moment when Percy, sensing he was being watched, turned to find himself less than 30 yards from the massive predator. Unlike many bear encounters, where the animal might make a bluff charge or display defensive behavior, this bear launched into an immediate full attack. Wildlife experts who later reviewed the footage noted that the bear's body language indicated clear predatory intent rather than defensive aggression, a crucial distinction that likely determined the outcome of the encounter. Percy attempted to deploy his bear spray, but the animal closed the distance too quickly. The camera recorded the bear striking him with a powerful swipe from its front paw, sending him crashing into a fallen log. The impact caused severe trauma to Percy's skull and left deep lacerations across his face and neck. The camera continued recording for several more seconds, capturing the bear mauling him, focusing primarily on his head and upper body, behavior indicative of a predatory attack rather than a defensive one. In what park rangers later described as an extraordinary stroke of both misfortune and fortune, Percy had positioned himself directly between the bear and its cached kill. Had it not been for Percy's decision to employ the last resort survival technique of playing dead, either intentionally or due to losing consciousness, the attack might have continued to its fatal conclusion. The footage showed the bear standing over Percy's motionless form for nearly a minute before it turned away toward its original kill site. Despite suffering catastrophic injuries, Percy regained consciousness approximately an hour later. Blood loss and trauma had sent him into shock, but he managed to activate his emergency satellite beacon before losing consciousness again. The International Emergency Response Center that received the distress signal immediately alerted Alaska Wildlife Troopers and the Coast Guard. A rescue helicopter located Percy's position shortly after dawn the following day. First responders found him barely alive, having survived the night despite temperatures dropping into the low 40s. Percy had suffered a fractured skull, a broken jaw, severed facial nerves, partial scalping, and deep puncture wounds to his shoulders and chest. Medical professionals later stated that his heavy camera backpack had likely protected his spine from being crushed by the bear's bite. After being airlifted to Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center and later transferred to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, Percy underwent 11 surgeries over the course of 9 months. He lost sight in his right eye and experienced permanent nerve damage, which affected his facial expressions and fine motor control in his hands. The bear was not pursued or euthanized, as wildlife officials determined it had been behaving naturally, defending a food resource within its territory. The area where the attack occurred was temporarily closed to human activity, but it was reopened the following season with enhanced warning signage about bear activity. Against all medical expectations, Percy returned to photography 18 months after the attack, though he never again worked alone in bear country. His photo essay about the experience, titled The Predator's Gaze, won multiple international awards and became a cornerstone resource in wildlife safety education. When interviewed years later about why he had chosen to continue his career after such trauma, Percy explained that his near-death experience had given him a deeper appreciation for the true nature of wild animals, not as the anthropomorphized creatures often portrayed in the media, but as powerful beings operating according to ancient imperatives of survival. By 2019, the remote wilderness areas surrounding Whistler, British Columbia, had attracted extreme sports enthusiasts for decades, offering some of North America's most challenging backcountry snowboarding terrain. These pristine mountain slopes, located approximately 40 kilometers northeast of the popular Whistler Blackcomb Resort, remained largely undeveloped and provided habitat for numerous wildlife species, including a healthy population of grizzly bears that typically hibernated in high-elevation dens during the winter months. Liam Mackenzie, a 28-year-old snowboard instructor from Calgary, Alberta, had been exploring British Columbia's backcountry for over 8 years. Mackenzie possessed extensive wilderness experience and held certifications in avalanche safety, wilderness first aid, and backcountry navigation. His friend Jake Morrison, a 31-year-old ski patrol member from Vancouver, had accompanied Mackenzie on numerous previous expeditions and shared his passion for discovering untouched powder snow in remote mountain locations. On March 15, 2019, the two men set out from a trailhead near Pemberton to access a series of north-facing slopes that had received nearly 2 meters of fresh snow the previous week. Weather conditions were ideal for backcountry snowboarding, with clear skies, minimal wind, and stable snow conditions that posed little avalanche risk, according to the Canadian Avalanche Center's daily bulletin. The area they planned to explore was known among local backcountry enthusiasts as particularly pristine, partly because its remote location and technical approach discouraged casual visitors. However, this isolation also meant that the region remained a largely undisturbed wildlife habitat, where bears, mountain goats, and other large mammals lived with minimal human interference for most of the year. After hiking for 3 hours with their snowboards and safety equipment, Mackenzie and Morrison reached their intended starting point at approximately 2,200 meters elevation. The slope they selected offered nearly 800 vertical meters of untracked powder snow, with a gradual pitch allowing long, flowing turns through widely spaced alpine fir trees. Morrison later told investigators that both men had conducted thorough safety checks of their avalanche beacons, probes, and shovels before beginning their descent. They had also established communication protocols and planned to maintain visual contact throughout their runs down the mountain. Mackenzie took the lead and descended at approximately 11:30 a.m., carving elegant turns through the deep powder while Morrison watched from above. The snow conditions were exceptional, and Mackenzie enjoyed the pristine terrain as he made his way down the slope with obvious skill and confidence. Unknown to both snowboarders, they had entered an area immediately adjacent to a grizzly bear's winter den site. Wildlife biologists would later determine that the bear, an adult female weighing approximately 180 kilograms, had been disturbed from hibernation by the vibrations and sounds of the snowboarder's approach. Grizzly bears roused from winter sleep are typically disoriented, extremely aggressive, and driven by powerful protective instincts. The bear suddenly emerged from her den, when Mackenzie was approximately 200 meters into his descent. Morrison, who had an unobstructed view of the entire incident, watched in horror as the grizzly charged with incredible speed across the snowy terrain directly at his friend. The bear struck Mackenzie with devastating force, knocking him from his snowboard and sending both the man and animal tumbling down the steep slope in a chaotic mass of snow and violence. Morrison immediately began shouting and threw his snowboard down the hill, hoping to distract the bear from its attack on Mackenzie. The grizzly's relentless aggression focused entirely on Mackenzie, who could not defend himself effectively while tangled in deep snow and steep terrain. Morrison later described the attack as lasting approximately 2 minutes, during which he continued his desperate attempts to intervene by making noise and throwing equipment toward the bear. When the bear finally disengaged and retreated toward the tree line, Morrison immediately activated his satellite emergency beacon and began walking down to Mackenzie's position. He found his friend critically injured and unresponsive, with severe trauma to his head, chest, and limbs. Morrison performed CPR and first aid procedures while waiting for emergency response teams, but Mackenzie had sustained injuries that proved fatal despite these efforts. The helicopter rescue team, led by experienced mountain rescue specialist Sarah Chen, reached the accident site within 90 minutes of Morrison's initial distress call. The recovery operation required significant coordination between multiple agencies, including Parks Canada wildlife officers, British Columbia Emergency Health Services, and specialized mountain rescue teams. Morrison was evacuated along with Mackenzie's body, though he had not sustained physical injuries during the incident. The attack shocked the tight-knit backcountry snowboarding community throughout Western Canada. Many experienced riders had assumed that winter conditions virtually eliminated the risk of bear encounters, since these animals typically hibernated during the snow season. Wildlife experts explained that climate change and increasingly variable weather patterns had begun affecting bear hibernation cycles, with some animals experiencing interrupted sleep during warm spells or unusual disturbances. They noted that den sites in popular backcountry recreation areas posed previously unrecognized risks to winter sports enthusiasts. Morrison's detailed eyewitness account proved crucial for understanding the circumstances that led to the fatal attack. His testimony helped wildlife managers develop new safety protocols for backcountry users and contributed to research about bear behavior during hibernation periods. The incident prompted discussions about whether certain high-elevation areas known to contain bear dens should be restricted during winter months. However, the remote nature of most backcountry terrain made such restrictions difficult to implement effectively. Morrison required extensive counseling to cope with the psychological trauma of witnessing his friend's death, and he temporarily suspended his backcountry activities while processing the experience. Of 2019, the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York displayed their legendary fall colors, drawing thousands of visitors to experience the region's spectacular natural beauty. Established as a protected Forever Wild area in 1892, the Adirondack Park encompassed 6 million acres of forests, lakes, and mountains, the largest publicly protected area in the contiguous United States. While much of the park had developed tourist infrastructure, substantial portions remained genuine wilderness, home to healthy populations of black bears that had grown increasingly habituated to human presence over decades of conservation management. Zachariah Pemberton and Valencia Orozco Pemberton had chosen the Adirondacks to celebrate their 5th wedding anniversary. The couple from Boston, he a software developer and she a pediatric nurse, had met during college volunteer work, building hiking trails in these very mountains. Returning to the region held special significance for them, and they had splurged on renting a luxury cabin near Long Lake, approximately 30 miles from the nearest sizable town. Whispering Pines Retreat sat on 3 private acres bordering state forest land, advertised online as offering authentic wilderness seclusion with modern amenities. The A-frame structure featured panoramic windows overlooking a serene pond, a spacious deck with outdoor grilling facilities, and rustic chic decor that matched the couple's aesthetic preferences perfectly. What the listing failed to mention was the property's history of wildlife encounters, specifically the increasing frequency of bear sightings in the area over the previous 2 years. The Pembertons arrived at the cabin on October 12th, delighted to find it even more charming than the photographs suggested. They spent their first day hiking nearby trails and returned exhausted but satisfied to prepare a celebratory anniversary dinner. Valencia had brought special ingredients for grilling steaks and vegetables on the deck's elaborate barbecue setup, and the couple enjoyed their meal as twilight descended over the pond. Environmental conservation officers would later determine that several critical errors occurred that evening. The Pembertons, though environmentally conscious, were urban dwellers unfamiliar with proper food management in bear country. They had cleaned the grill only superficially after cooking, leaving substantial grease and food residue on the grates and in the drip pan. Additionally, they had disposed of food scraps in an ordinary kitchen trash can inside the cabin, rather than using the bear-resistant container provided in a separate utility shed, a detail mentioned only briefly in the back pages of the cabin's information binder. According to Valencia's subsequent account to authorities, the couple had retired around 10:30 p.m. after enjoying wine by the fireplace. The bedroom was located on the cabin's second-floor loft, while the kitchen and living area occupied the open-concept main floor below. At approximately 2:15 a.m., they were awakened by what Zachariah initially assumed was a raccoon or squirrel rummaging through the kitchen. When the sounds of breaking glass and clattering metal intensified, Zachariah decided to investigate. Valencia reported that she had urged him to stay in the bedroom, but he had insisted on checking, taking only his phone as a flashlight. From the loft railing, he shone the light down into the kitchen area and found himself face to face with a medium-sized black bear that had entered through a window the couple had left partially open for fresh air. The bear, estimated by wildlife officials to weigh approximately 250 pounds, had already scattered trash across the kitchen floor and was aggressively exploring the refrigerator contents. Startled by the sudden light, the animal looked up toward Zachariah on the loft and immediately displayed signs of agitation, huffing loudly and swatting at the countertop. Zachariah backed slowly toward the bedroom door, but the bear, perhaps feeling cornered or simply following the food scent, began climbing the wooden staircase to the loft. Valencia recalled hearing Zachariah shout for her to barricade the bedroom door as he tried to divert the bear's attention. She grabbed their suitcases and pushed them against the door while searching frantically for anything that could be used as a weapon. The bear reached the top of the stairs with surprising speed. Valencia heard a heavy thud against the bedroom door, followed by Zachariah's scream of pain. The door frame splintered as the bear forced its way into the room. In the chaos that followed, the animal delivered a powerful blow to Zachariah's chest that knocked him against the wall before turning toward Valencia. In what conservation officers later described as remarkable presence of mind, Valencia remembered the bear spray they had purchased for hiking, still in her backpack from the day's excursion. She lunged for the pack, extracted the canister, and discharged a full blast of the capsaicin-based deterrent directly into the bear's face from approximately 5 feet away. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The bear recoiled, pawing frantically at its eyes and snout while emitting distressed vocalizations. It retreated blindly, tumbling partly down the staircase before regaining its balance and crashing back through the kitchen and out the broken window. Valencia found Zachariah conscious but seriously injured, with deep lacerations across his chest and a compound fracture to his left arm where the bear's claws had torn through muscle and bone. The cabin's landline had been damaged during the bear's rampage, and cell service was non-existent in the remote location. Valencia applied pressure dressings to Zachariah's wounds using clean clothing and helped him to their vehicle. The nearest hospital was 45 minutes away along dark, winding mountain roads. Valencia later recalled that Zachariah remained conscious throughout most of the drive, going into shock only as they pulled into the emergency department parking lot around 3:30 a.m. Medical personnel stabilized him before transferring him to a trauma center in Albany, where he underwent 7 hours of surgery to repair nerve and tissue damage. By remarkable coincidence, the couple was spotted driving toward the hospital by a local fisherman, Marcus Adirondack, who was heading out for early morning fishing. Noticing their erratic driving and hazard lights, he followed them to the hospital and then used his local knowledge to guide authorities back to the cabin site, where environmental conservation officers documented the scene and set traps for the bear. The animal was captured 2 days later, still in the vicinity of the cabin and attempting to access another vacation property's unsecured trash. Following state protocol for bears that have injured humans, officials euthanized and examined the animal. The necropsy revealed the bear was a healthy 4-year-old male with no signs of disease or injury that might have explained unusual aggression. Its stomach contents included numerous food items consistent with human garbage, evidence of previous successful raids on unsecured trash. The incident prompted the Essex County Board of Supervisors to implement stricter regulations for vacation rental properties in bear habitat, requiring owners to install bear-resistant trash containers and provide prominent safety information to guests. The New York Department of Environmental Conservation also initiated an expanded public education campaign about proper food storage in the Adirondack region. Zachariah Pemberton recovered after months of physical therapy, though with permanent nerve damage affecting grip strength in his left hand. The couple founded Bear Smart Adirondacks, a non-profit organization dedicated to reducing human-bear conflicts through education and improved waste management infrastructure throughout the park. Their anniversary tradition continued, though they now chose locations with fewer large carnivores, and they became meticulous about securing food and trash whenever they ventured into bear country. By 2021, the hiking and running trails network that crisscrossed a national forest in north-central Colorado near Fort Collins had become increasingly popular among outdoor enthusiasts. This section of wilderness, situated at approximately 2,400 meters in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains, provided habitat for numerous wildlife species, including a growing population of American black bears that had adapted well to the region's dense forest and open meadows. Sam Rodriguez, a 26-year-old software engineer from Denver, had been trail running for nearly 5 years and regularly explored remote paths throughout Colorado's mountain regions. Rodriguez specialized in ultra-distance running and often spent weekends covering 50 or more kilometers through backcountry terrain. His running partner, Leah Petrosky, was a 29-year-old physical therapist from Boulder who shared his passion for challenging mountain trails and had completed several ultramarathons in wilderness settings. On a warm Saturday morning in late August 2021, Rodriguez and Petrosky set out to explore a lesser-known trail system that wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine, aspen, and Douglas fir. Their selected trail was rated moderately difficult, with significant elevation changes and technical sections requiring careful navigation through rocky terrain and fallen timber. Recent drought conditions had affected much of Colorado that summer, creating stress for wildlife populations as traditional water sources dried up and natural food sources became scarce. Wildlife biologists had noted increased bear activity near human recreational areas as animals searched for alternative food and water sources. However, most encounters remained peaceful, as black bears typically avoided human contact. The section of the trail where the incident occurred passed through particularly dense forest cover. Mature pine trees created a canopy that blocked most direct sunlight and supported an understory of thick brush and fallen logs. This environment provided an ideal habitat for black bears, offering both food sources and shelter from the intense summer heat. At approximately 10:15 a.m., Rodriguez and Petrosky were running single file along a narrow section of trail when they inadvertently startled a large black bear resting on a low-hanging branch approximately 3 meters above the path. The bear, later estimated by wildlife officers to weigh around 140 kilograms, had been using the elevated position to escape ground-level heat while remaining alert for potential food sources. Black bears are naturally excellent climbers and often rest in trees during hot weather, but they typically choose higher positions that provide better visibility and security. Wildlife experts later theorized that this particular bear had selected an unusually low perch because drought conditions had weakened many of the area's larger trees, making higher branches unsafe for supporting the animal's weight. The bear's reaction to being surprised was immediate and aggressive. Rather than retreating up the tree or fleeing into the forest, as black bears typically do when encountering humans, this animal dropped directly onto the trail between Rodriguez and Petrovsky and immediately charged toward Rodriguez, who was running in the lead position. Approximately 10 meters behind her running partner, Petrovsky witnessed the events unfold with terrifying speed. She later told investigators that the bear's initial charge gave Rodriguez no opportunity to retreat or take defensive measures, as the animal covered the short distance between them in less than 2 seconds. The bear struck Rodriguez with its front paws, knocking him off the trail and into a dense thicket of mountain mahogany bushes. Rodriguez later described feeling the bear's claws rake across his back and shoulders as he fell, though his running shirt and hydration pack absorbed some of the impact. The bear followed up its initial attack by swiping at Rodriguez several more times, inflicting puncture wounds on his arms and legs. Petrovsky's immediate response was to scramble up the nearest suitable tree, a mature aspen approximately 15 meters from where Rodriguez had fallen. Her rock climbing experience proved invaluable, as she reached a roughly 6-meter height within seconds of the bear's initial charge. Petrovsky saw the ongoing attack from her elevated position and began shouting at the bear to distract it from Rodriguez. She later reported that the bear seemed focused exclusively on Rodriguez and paid no attention to her presence in the tree, even when she threw pine cones and small branches toward the animal. The attack lasted approximately 90 seconds before the bear suddenly disengaged and retreated into the dense forest. Wildlife experts later speculated that the bear's aggression had been defensive rather than predatory. Once it was determined that the perceived threat had been neutralized, its instinct was to flee the area. Rodriguez remained conscious throughout the attack, though he was severely shaken and bleeding from multiple wounds. Petrovsky waited several minutes to ensure the bear had truly departed, before climbing down from her tree and approaching Rodriguez's position. Using her medical training, Petrovsky assessed Rodriguez's injuries and determined that while they were painful and bleeding significantly, none appeared immediately life-threatening. She used supplies from their shared first aid kit to clean and bandage the most serious wounds, while Rodriguez contacted emergency services using his satellite communication device. The rescue operation required coordination between Boulder County search and rescue teams and Colorado Parks and wildlife officers. Emergency medical technicians reached Rodriguez and Petrovsky within 2 hours of the initial incident, hiking approximately 5 kilometers on foot to reach the remote attack site. Rodriguez was transported to a community health hospital, where he received treatment for multiple puncture wounds, lacerations, and potential infection from the bear's claws. He required 43 stitches across various wounds, but was released after 2 days of observation and antibiotic treatment. The incident prompted renewed emphasis on bear safety education for trail runners and hikers in Colorado's mountain regions. Wildlife officials noted that the attack demonstrated how even typically non-aggressive black bears could become dangerous when surprised or stressed by environmental conditions. Rodriguez and Petrovsky returned to trail running within 6 weeks of the incident. However, they began carrying bear spray and adopted new safety protocols for runs in areas with known bear populations. Their experience contributed to local running group discussions about wildlife awareness and emergency preparedness in backcountry settings. Piatra Neamț, Romania, October 12, 2018. The Carpathian Mountains, stretching across Eastern Europe like an ancient spine, have long been a source of mineral wealth. For centuries, these rugged peaks were mined for salt, silver, and gold, leaving behind a vast hidden network of tunnels, shafts, and chambers beneath the forest floor. Near the scenic Romanian town of Piatra Neamț, many of these subterranean structures remain buried under layers of moss and silence, relics of long-forgotten industry. Among those captivated by these spaces was Dr. Matei Antonescu, a seasoned speleologist working with a leading geological research institute. Over a 15-year career, Antonescu had earned respect for his meticulous cave surveys and ecological fieldwork across the Eastern Carpathians. At 47, he remained deeply dedicated to exploring remote environments, often alone. In the fall of 2018, his attention turned to a rarely documented 19th-century silver mine carved during the Austro-Hungarian period. Located in a remote sector of the mountains, the site had seen little human presence in decades. Antonescu hoped to map its internal layout and assess its potential for future ecological research before winter snows made access impossible. That October brought an earlier-than-expected seasonal shift. Cold air swept down from the peaks, and wildlife had already begun retreating into dens. On the morning of the 12th, under overcast skies, Antonescu left his temporary field camp and set off toward the site. His assistant had returned to the capital 2 days prior for personal reasons, but rather than postpone the trip, Antonescu pressed on alone, something he had done many times before. With basic survival gear and layered clothing, he navigated a forest trail until reaching the mine entrance. Hidden by fallen branches and thick undergrowth, the entrance required minor clearing. Once inside, the air was cool and damp, filled with the sharp scent of stone. But something else lingered, a musty animal scent that made him pause. Still, he continued forward. Activating his headlamp, Antonescu documented his surroundings as he advanced into the mine. The main tunnel sloped gently downward, its timber supports surprisingly intact. After about 40 meters, the passage split into 3 smaller corridors. Following procedure, he marked his position and selected the center tunnel for initial exploration. As he progressed, the space narrowed. Soon he was crawling through a constricted shaft, the sounds of his movement, boots scraping, gear brushing rock, amplified by the close walls. Unknown to him, these noises were disturbing something further below. The warning came suddenly. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the tunnel. Antonescu froze, then slowly raised his headlamp. About 10 meters ahead, just past where the tunnel widened again, 2 amber-colored eyes reflected in his beam, eyes fixed on him from a massive shape in the darkness. A Carpathian brown bear, a large, solitary male estimated later to weigh nearly 300 kilograms, had taken refuge in the mine. It had likely selected the shaft as an early denning site, retreating from the approaching cold and encroaching human activity in the surrounding forest. Feeling cornered and defensive, the bear charged. Antonescu scrambled backward, slipping on the slick floor. One of the animal's swipes tore through his clothing and left a deep injury to his left shoulder, slamming him into the rock wall. Despite the pain, he remained conscious. In the confusion, he spotted a narrow crevice formed by a collapsed beam and wedged himself tightly into the gap, just wide enough to keep the bear from reaching him directly. For 6 hours, he remained there, wounded, silent, and motionless. The bear did not immediately leave. It paced nearby, growling intermittently and occasionally swiping at the rock barrier. The confined space amplified every sound. Blood from his injury soaked into his clothing, and the cold air inside the mine began draining his strength. His phone, tucked in his pack, was unusable. The rock above blocked any signal. As dusk approached and the forest outside began to darken, the bear eventually withdrew deeper into the mine. Still, Antonescu waited another hour before daring to move. Slowly and with great effort, he crawled out of the narrow space and began retracing his steps through the tunnel. Every movement deliberate, every sound weighed against the possibility of triggering another response. By the time he reached the forest outside, night had nearly fallen. Exhausted, cold, and in pain, he made his way to his vehicle and drove to the nearest settlement. Local residents quickly recognized the seriousness of his injuries. An experienced physician provided initial treatment before arranging transfer to a hospital in the nearest city. Investigations later confirmed a broader trend. Brown bears across the Carpathians had increasingly begun using abandoned human-made structures, like old mines and cellars, for shelter. As logging and development disrupted their natural habitats, bears adapted by seeking isolated and quiet spaces underground. Wildlife authorities reviewed the incident and determined the bear had responded instinctively to a perceived threat in its temporary shelter. No further action was taken against the animal. Though Antonescu's physical recovery was swift, the psychological effects took longer to fade. When he returned to the field, he implemented strict new protocols. Remote camera probes were deployed before entering any cave or tunnel, and all expeditions, regardless of familiarity with the site, were done with at least one additional team member. His account of the event, later published in a scientific journal, played a key role in updating national safety guidelines for researchers and conservationists working in bear habitats. The old mine has remained undisturbed since, its shadowed corridors unofficially returned to the wilderness that reclaimed them. Today, Antonescu continues his work with a renewed sense of caution and respect for the unpredictable world beneath the forest floor. His experience is now required reading for new field researchers, serving as a powerful reminder that even the most experienced professionals are never truly alone in the wild. By 2020, The remote archipelago of Svalbard had become a crucial research location for understanding Arctic climate change, attracting scientists worldwide to study the rapid transformation of polar ice environments. Located approximately 1,000 kilometers north of mainland Norway, this harsh landscape provided unique opportunities to observe how warming temperatures affected sea ice formation, wildlife behavior, and ecosystem dynamics. Erik Larsen, a 37-year-old glaciologist from the Norwegian Institute for Polar Research, had spent the previous 4 years conducting fieldwork throughout the Arctic region. Larsen specialized in studying ice core samples that revealed historical climate patterns, and his current expedition focused on collecting data from previously unstudied ice formations near the eastern edge of Spitsbergen, Svalbard's largest island. His research assistant, Ingrid Holmberg, was a 28-year-old graduate student from a university in Tromsø who had joined Larsen's team 6 months earlier. Holmberg's background in Arctic biology complemented Larsen's geological expertise, and she was responsible for documenting how changing ice conditions affected local wildlife populations, particularly seals and polar bears. Their research station was established on stable sea ice, approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest land. This location was selected because it provided access to recent ice formations and older, multi-year ice containing valuable historical data. The camp consisted of 2 reinforced tents, scientific equipment, emergency supplies, and communication gear that maintained contact with their support team in Longyearbyen. On April 3, 2020, weather conditions were ideal for fieldwork, with clear visibility, minimal wind, and temperatures hovering around -15 degrees Celsius. Larsen planned to venture approximately 800 meters from their base camp to collect ice samples from a formation that appeared to contain layers dating back several decades. The sea ice in their research area had been affected by unusual warming trends that created a complex landscape of stable platforms connected by thin ice bridges and separated by areas of open water. This environment required constant vigilance and careful route planning, as ice conditions could change rapidly due to currents, wind, and temperature fluctuations. Holmberg remained at the base camp to monitor communications and track Larsen's movements using GPS equipment. She also observed seal behavior through high-powered binoculars. Her elevated position on a stable ice platform provided excellent visibility across the surrounding area, including Larsen's intended sampling location. Larsen set out at approximately 9:30 a.m., pulling a specialized sled containing ice-coring equipment, sample containers, and safety gear. His route took him across several small ice bridges and around areas of questionable stability, requiring careful evaluation of each step across the constantly shifting surface. Unknown to both researchers, a large adult male polar bear had been tracking their activities for several hours. Polar bears are exceptional hunters with acute senses of smell and hearing, capable of detecting prey from considerable distances across sea ice. Climate change has severely impacted traditional hunting opportunities for polar bears, forcing them to adapt their behavior and increasingly consider human presence as potential food sources. The bear, later estimated by wildlife experts to weigh approximately 450 kilograms, had been using ice ridges and snow formations to conceal its approach toward Larsen's position. Polar bears are remarkably skilled at moving silently across ice terrain, and this particular animal demonstrated the hunting prowess that made its species one of the Arctic's most formidable predators. Holmberg first noticed unusual movement approximately 200 meters from Larsen's location at 10:45 a.m. Through her binoculars, she initially mistook the shape for a piece of debris or ice formation. Still, she quickly realized she was observing a polar bear moving with obvious predatory intent toward her colleague. Her immediate response was to activate their emergency communication system and attempt to warn Larsen using their radio equipment. However, Larsen was focused on his ice-coring work and had temporarily removed his radio headset to concentrate on the technical aspects of sample collection. The polar bear's charge was sudden and devastating. Holmberg watched helplessly as the massive predator burst from its concealed position and covered the distance to Larsen in seconds. The bear's attack was swift and decisive, overwhelming Larsen before he could react or deploy any of his safety equipment. Holmberg immediately began firing emergency flares to distract the bear and frighten it away from Larsen. She activated their satellite emergency beacon and began broadcasting distress calls on multiple radio frequencies, hoping to reach their support team or passing aircraft. Despite her frantic efforts, the bear's attack proved fatal within minutes. Holmberg continued her rescue attempts for nearly an hour, firing additional flares and making noise to drive the bear away. Still, the animal remained in the area and showed no signs of abandoning its prey. Emergency response teams from Longyearbyen received Holmberg's distress signal and immediately dispatched a helicopter rescue team, but Arctic weather conditions delayed their arrival by several hours. When rescuers finally reached the research site, they found Holmberg in severe psychological shock, but physically unharmed. The bear had dragged Larsson's remains onto unstable ice that eventually broke away from the main ice platform, making immediate recovery impossible. Search teams continued efforts for 5 days before recovering Larsson's body, approximately 3 kilometers from the original attack site. The incident highlighted the increasing dangers Arctic researchers face as climate change altered ice conditions and polar bear behavior. Wildlife experts noted that shrinking sea ice forced polar bears to expand their hunting strategies and consider humans as potential prey sources, particularly in remote areas where the animals had little previous exposure to people. Following the traumatic experience, Holmberg required extensive psychological counseling and eventually changed her research focus away from Arctic fieldwork. Her detailed eyewitness account provided valuable insights into polar bear hunting behavior and contributed to new safety protocols for researchers in polar bear habitats. The tragedy prompted Norwegian authorities to implement stricter safety requirements for Arctic expeditions, including mandatory armed escorts in areas with known polar bear populations and enhanced communication protocols for remote research operations. Cassiar Highway, British Columbia, July 8, 2016. Cutting through some of North America's most remote terrain, the Cassiar Highway stretches for 874 kilometers across northern British Columbia, linking it to the Yukon. For much of its route, the 2-lane road traverses an immense wilderness, forested ridgelines, alpine passes, and long, empty valleys where cell coverage vanishes and traffic is a rare occurrence. 42-year-old Emmett Hollingsworth knew this stretch well. A seasoned tradesman, he had worked throughout the northern industrial circuits for over a decade and understood the challenges of traveling through the backcountry. But this trip was different. His 12-year-old daughter Zephyr was with him, visiting his worksite during her summer break. That year, the region was experiencing unseasonably high temperatures. Days climbed above 30 degrees Celsius, even at elevation, and wildlife biologists later noted behavioral shifts among native species. Grizzly bears, in particular, had been sighted in unfamiliar areas, drawn by water sources, roadkill, or in some cases, the smell of food left by passing travelers. Roughly 320 kilometers north of the nearest settlement, with no services for hours in either direction, Emmett's truck began to overheat. Steam rose from the hood. A quick inspection revealed a split radiator hose, a relatively minor failure under normal conditions, but a serious one this far from assistance. There was no phone reception and traffic was sparse. They had seen only 2 other vehicles that day. Emmett began unloading supplies to locate his emergency repair kit. 2 coolers were set aside, one containing perishable food, and bags and camping gear were moved from the cab. As he searched, neither he nor Zephyr noticed the grizzly bear until it emerged silently from the tree line, just off the road behind them. The bear, later identified through tracks and analysis as a mature male weighing approximately 280 kilograms, was likely drawn by the scent of food. It stood at the forest's edge, head high, testing the air. Zephyr spotted it first. Her sudden reaction drew Emmett's attention. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. Staying calm, he instructed his daughter to slowly retreat toward the truck. He attempted to deter the bear by making himself appear larger, waving his arms, shouting, tossing small rocks into the nearby brush. These gestures gave the bear a momentary pause, but they weren't enough to turn it away. Its attention was locked on the open cooler. As the bear began to approach, Emmett knew the priority was safety. He helped Zephyr climb onto the roof of the pickup truck, following quickly behind. From this vantage point, they remained visible but out of immediate reach. What followed was nearly 50 minutes of tense observation. The bear moved with deliberate ease, using its powerful limbs to tear open the cooler, scatter food across the gravel, and crush containers with little effort. It showed minimal interest in the humans watching from above. acknowledging them occasionally with a glance, but never directly threatening them. The midday heat posed a different danger. The sun beat down on the metal roof of the vehicle, quickly turning it into a scorching surface. Zephyr's skin began to redden and blister in places. Emmett gave her his shirt, using it to create a thin barrier between her and the hot metal. Still, the discomfort grew with every passing minute. Eventually, a camper van appeared on the road, heading north. Emmett signaled urgently. The vehicle slowed. Its driver, Reginald Pearson, a retired wilderness ranger, immediately understood the situation. He used the van's horn repeatedly, creating enough noise to unsettle the bear. After a final glance, the animal began to retreat. Not hurriedly, but with the same steady confidence it had shown throughout. It disappeared into the trees. Pearson provided first aid for Zephyr's minor burns and shared water and supplies. Drawing on his experience, he helped Emmett fashion a temporary fix using duct tape and a section of hose from his own vehicle. He then escorted the truck for the remaining 80 kilometers to the nearest fuel stop to ensure they reached safety. Wildlife authorities later reviewed the incident and found that the bear had behaved naturally, drawn by accessible food, not aggression. The site was added to a list of locations for updated safety signage, reminding travelers to secure all food and waste properly, even in areas where bear sightings are infrequent. For Zephyr, the event left more than physical marks. In the weeks that followed, she struggled with sleep and developed anxiety around animal sounds. Even benign wilderness audio, like wind in the trees or a crackling campfire, could spark moments of fear. With counseling and support, she gradually regained confidence. Over time, her experience became a source of strength. She began volunteering with local conservation groups and eventually speaking to youth programs about coexisting with wildlife. Her presentations emphasized preparation, awareness, and respect, not fear. Photographs from that day, captured by Pearson, were later used in public education materials. The story resonated across the province, not as a tale of survival, but as a call for responsibility in shared landscapes. Emmett, when asked in a later interview what he remembered most, didn't speak of the fear or the damage. Instead, he described the bear's quiet presence. What endured most for the Hollingsworths wasn't the destruction or the fear. It was a shift in perspective. The bear had moved with calm assurance, unhurried and unafraid, as if the land itself recognized it. In that moment, it was clear. This was its territory, not theirs. The annual Karluk River Salmon Derby on Kodiak Island, Alaska, had attracted fishing enthusiasts across North America for over 30 years by 2018. This remote location, accessible only by bush plane or boat, offered some of the world's premier salmon fishing opportunities during the late summer spawning runs. The Karluk River system, flowing through pristine wilderness on the southwestern portion of Kodiak Island, supported massive populations of silver salmon, king salmon, and sockeye salmon that drew human anglers and the island's famous population of Kodiak brown bears. The 2018 competition, scheduled for the third weekend of August, had drawn approximately 150 participants who established a temporary camp along a 3-kilometer stretch of riverbank. Contest organizers selected this location because it provided excellent fishing access while remaining sufficiently distant from known bear concentration areas typically formed around major salmon runs. Lena Kowalski, a 42-year-old wildlife photographer from Anchorage, had traveled to Kodiak Island not to participate in the fishing competition, but to document the event for Alaska Outdoors magazine. Kowalski specialized in capturing images of outdoor recreational activities in remote Alaska locations, and she had obtained special permission from contest organizers to photograph the derby from various vantage points along the riverbank. The competition format required participants to catch, measure, and release salmon over 2 days, with prizes awarded for the largest fish in several categories. Ivan Petrov, a 35-year-old commercial fisherman from Homer, Alaska, had participated in the Karluk River Derby for 7 consecutive years and was considered among the most skilled anglers in the competition. Kodiak brown bears, among the largest bear subspecies in North America, typically concentrate around salmon streams during spawning season to take advantage of this abundant protein source before winter hibernation. Wildlife biologists estimated that approximately 3,500 bears inhabited Kodiak Island, creating one of the highest bear densities in Alaska. Competition organizers had implemented standard bear safety protocols, including mandatory bear spray for all participants, proper food storage requirements, and guidelines for maintaining clean campsites. However, the event's popularity and the large quantity of fresh fish created conditions that inevitably attracted attention. On the second day of the competition, weather conditions were ideal with clear skies and calm winds that made for excellent fishing. By mid-afternoon, participants had already landed dozens of salmon, and the temporary cleaning stations established along the riverbank were processing significant quantities of fresh fish. Kowalski had positioned herself approximately 50 meters upstream from the main competition area to photograph anglers working the most productive fishing holes. From her elevated position on a small bluff, she had an excellent view of the entire event and captured images of successful catches throughout the afternoon. At approximately 3:15 p.m., Kowalski noticed a massive Kodiak bear approaching the competition area through dense alder brush that lined the riverbank. The bear, which she later estimated to weigh over 400 kilograms, was attracted by the smell of freshly caught salmon and the fish cleaning activities throughout the camp. The bear's approach was initially stealthy, moving through the vegetation with surprising quiet for such a large animal. However, as it drew closer to the human activity, the bear became bolder and more direct in its movement toward the fish cleaning stations, where contest participants were processing their catches. Kowalski immediately began photographing the bear's approach, while also attempting to alert nearby anglers to the developing situation. However, the noise of running water, conversation, and fishing activity masked her initial warnings, and several participants remained unaware of the approaching danger. The bear's entrance into the camp area was sudden and chaotic. Rather than approaching cautiously, as bears sometimes do in such situations, this animal charged directly into the crowd of anglers, clearly intent on accessing the fresh salmon that had attracted its attention. Panic erupted immediately as approximately 30 people scattered in all directions, abandoning expensive fishing equipment and personal belongings to escape the massive predator. Several participants attempted to retreat to nearby trees, while others ran toward the temporary structures that served as registration and first aid stations. Ivan Petrov, who had been cleaning a large king salmon at one of the processing tables, found himself in the bear's path as it charged toward the fish cleaning area.
A protected wilderness area in Alaska, August 17, 2013. A remote river in this vast region has long been known as one of the world's premier places to witness brown bears during the salmon run. Each summer, as sockeye salmon return to their ancestral spawning grounds, dozens of massive grizzly bears gather along the river's edge, creating one of the most breathtaking natural spectacles in North America. For wildlife photographers and adventurers alike, watching these powerful animals deftly pull fish from the rushing current offers a quintessential experience of Alaska's wild spirit. For Nathaniel Blackburn, a 44-year-old commercial fisherman from Kodiak Island, this river symbolized more than a photographic opportunity. It was a living laboratory, a place where he could study the behavior of wild salmon and perhaps gain insight into the dwindling salmon returns that had increasingly threatened his livelihood. With specialized permission from land management authorities, Blackburn set up a small temporary research outpost approximately 2 kilometers upstream from the river's more famous waterfall viewing area, a part of the watershed rarely frequented by tourists. The summer of 2013 brought an exceptional surge of salmon to the region. Biologists recorded the highest sockeye return in over 10 years, and the watershed teemed with activity. The abundance of fish, however, also drew in an unusually large number of grizzly bears. Wildlife monitors documented nearly 60 different bears that season, almost twice the average count for that area. On a cool August morning, Blackburn waded into the thigh-deep river to check underwater netting designed to briefly trap salmon for sampling and measurement before their release. His gear was technical and his methods precise, aimed at minimizing disturbance to the riverbed. His research site had been chosen for its relative isolation and safety. Flanked by steep canyon walls and featuring limited access points, the location allowed clear views in both directions. In previous weeks, he had only encountered bears at a distance. But nature is unpredictable. That morning, midway through a routine river crossing, Blackburn heard the unmistakable crack of breaking branches from the upstream forest. A massive male grizzly bear, later identified by field monitors as one of the dominant individuals in the area, emerged from the tree line roughly 40 meters away. The bear, estimated at nearly 480 kilograms, was in his physical prime, muscular, alert, and intensely focused. Biologists would later theorize that this particular bear had been displaced from its preferred fishing grounds by younger rivals and was now exploring alternative sites. Blackburn, caught in the middle of the river, had no time to reach either bank safely. With no other viable option, he scrambled onto a partially submerged fallen tree stretching across part of the channel. The log was slick with moss and river spray, offering little grip or comfort. As the cold water swirled around him, he could only watch as the bear entered the water upstream. To his relief, the bear appeared uninterested in his presence. Instead, the animal's attention was fixed on the salmon hovering just behind the submerged log. With swift, deliberate motions, the bear began fishing, its massive paws slicing through the current with remarkable precision. In one clean strike, it snatched a salmon from the water and tossed it onto a nearby boulder. For the next 20 minutes, Blackburn remained completely still, his muscles tensing with fatigue and his soaked gear drawing the chill deeper into his bones. The bear moved methodically, focusing on the task of feeding. Every sense was heightened for Blackburn. The scent of wet fur, the scrape of claws on stone, the subtle changes in current, each detail etched itself into his memory. Eventually, the bear moved further upstream, vanishing around a curve in the canyon. Still uncertain whether it might return, Blackburn remained motionless on the log for several more minutes. Only when the silence grew long and steady did he descend carefully and make his way to shore, his legs trembling from both the cold and the release of tension. Back at his camp, he reported the encounter to park headquarters via radio. A ranger advised him to relocate his equipment closer to regularly patrolled areas and noted that this particular bear had recently exhibited increased aggression, possibly due to an injury sustained in a territorial altercation with a younger male. Surveillance photos later showed a visible wound on the bear's shoulder, consistent with such a struggle. Though not life-threatening, the injury may have explained the bear's deviation from more competitive fishing zones. Blackburn finished his research session without further incident and left the area 3 days later. Before departing, he stopped by the ranger station, where staff shared more photos and observations about the bear. The experience left a lasting impression, not of danger, but of humility. In the years that followed, Blackburn returned to salmon research across Alaska. Though he continued his work, he never again conducted field operations alone in bear territory. His findings contributed to improved fishery management in multiple districts, influencing both policy and conservation efforts. During presentations to state officials and fellow researchers, he often opened with the story of that fateful morning, not as a tale of survival, but as a reflection on the delicate balance between human presence and wild ecosystems. He described how, in that frozen moment on the log, he understood something profound. The bear had not perceived him as a threat, a rival, or even as food. He was simply part of the scenery, irrelevant to the bear's purpose. This realization shifted his perspective on nature itself. It wasn't about control or strength. Survival often depended on stillness, observation, and restraint. Blackburn's reflections became central to his educational outreach. He often spoke of the log, not just as a piece of wood, but as a symbol of coexistence. For him, it represented the silent contract between human and wild, a space where fear and respect could coexist without conflict. In every story, he emphasized that stewardship of the natural world must come from a place of reverence, not dominance. Years later, as he continued to work on rivers across the region, Blackburn's thoughts often returned to that canyon, that bear, and that moment of absolute stillness. In a world increasingly shaped by human expansion, his message remained clear. In the wilderness, humility is not a weakness, it is survival. Amur Oblast, Russia, 2018. The vast wilderness of Amur Oblast had long been known for its unforgiving terrain and dangerous wildlife. Local hunters had passed down stories for generations about the massive grizzly bears that roamed these forests, territorial beasts that could weigh over 1,000 pounds. This fierce reputation attracted the producers of a popular survival competition show to film their newest season in the remote Russian wilderness, promising viewers the ultimate test of human endurance against nature's harshest elements. Thaddeus Blackwood, the show's ambitious executive producer, had insisted on pushing the contestants further than ever before. The 9 participants, ranging from former military personnel to wilderness experts, were carefully selected for their survival skills and camera-friendly personalities. Among them was Zara Thornfield, a former Olympic biathlete who had expressed concern about filming in bear territory without proper wildlife experts present. The production team established a base camp near a river known for its dramatic views and challenging environment. On the morning of the incident, Thornfield noticed fresh bear tracks near the camp. Her concerns, however, were downplayed by Blackwood, who reportedly considered such encounters valuable for the show's dramatic appeal. Although the safety protocols, questioned by local guides, recommended bear bells and spray, contestants were not allowed to carry firearms as part of the challenge. By the third day of filming, the contestants were divided into 3 teams, competing to gather food and build shelters. That morning, Merrick Holloway, the show's survival expert, demonstrated proper food storage techniques and emphasized the importance of separating cooking areas from sleeping quarters. Unfortunately, as the teams raced to complete their tasks before nightfall, these precautions were not consistently followed. As the sun set on June 17th, the exhausted contestants gathered around a communal fire to prepare their meals. Kasumi Watanabe, the team's medical expert, was tending to Orion Patel's injured hands when warning signs emerged. Birds suddenly took flight, and an eerie silence fell over the forest. Moments later, a massive grizzly bear, later estimated by wildlife officials to weigh around 980 pounds, emerged from the underbrush, likely attracted by the scent of cooked fish and dried meat. The animal charged at Dominique Lafleur, a mountaineer who was standing closest to the tree line. Attempting to retreat, Lafleur tripped over filming equipment and fell into the bear's path. The bear struck him, its claws tearing through his protective jacket and inflicting serious injuries. Chaos broke out as the contestants fled in different directions. Xavier Quintana, a former Special Forces member, tried to rally the others to group together and appear larger to deter the bear. However, panic had already spread. Thornfield managed to retrieve her bear spray, but the bear had already turned its attention to Anastasia Kuznetsov, the team's youngest member, who stood frozen in fear. The bear knocked Kuznetsov to the ground with alarming ease, standing over her as the camera operator, disregarding all established safety procedures, continued to record the unfolding incident. Acting swiftly, Holloway seized a flaming branch from the fire and rushed toward the bear, waving it aggressively and shouting to divert the animal's attention. The distraction created a critical opening, allowing Thornfield to use her bear spray at close range, discharging it directly into the bear's face. The bear, temporarily blinded and disoriented by the spray, reared back on its hind legs before charging in a new direction, this time toward Blackwood, who had been attempting to climb a nearby pine tree. The producer was dragged to the ground and sustained serious injuries, including deep lacerations to his legs and back. It was only after Quintana and Watanabe deployed 2 additional canisters of bear spray that the animal was finally driven off into the forest. In the aftermath, all 9 members of the expedition suffered injuries. Lafleur, Kuznetsov, and Blackwood sustained the most serious wounds and required immediate medical evacuation once emergency responders reached the remote site, approximately 6 hours later. The remaining participants endured various injuries, including deep cuts and fractures, many sustained while fleeing through dense undergrowth. Authorities later concluded that the bear had likely become habituated to human presence, possibly due to previous encounters with improperly stored food by hunters or trekkers. The incident ignited international debate regarding the ethics of producing reality television in dangerous wilderness environments, as well as the adequacy of safety protocols when working in known bear habitats. Following the incident, the survival competition series was canceled mid-season. Network executives cited insurmountable safety concerns as the official reason. After recovering from his injuries, Blackwood faced legal action from several contestants who alleged that the production had deliberately minimized known risks to heighten dramatic tension. Thornfield went on to become a vocal advocate for wildlife safety awareness, founding an organization called Respect Wild Spaces. The initiative focused on educating media crews about responsible practices when operating in remote natural areas. Although the footage of the bear encounter was never made public, it was later used in professional wildlife management training programs to highlight the dangers of human-bear interactions. The event stood as a sobering reminder that in the remote wilderness, humans are merely visitors in a world still ruled by powerful and unpredictable forces of nature. On May 10, 2025, deep in the wilderness of a remote region in eastern Russia, a campsite became the scene of one of the most horrific bear attacks in recent history. The dense forests of this area, known for their rugged terrain and diverse wildlife, had long been home to the formidable Ussuri brown bear, a subspecies of the grizzly bear noted for its immense size and power. That year, the region had endured an exceptionally harsh winter. Heavy snowfall and prolonged freezing temperatures had severely depleted natural food sources, pushing wildlife closer to areas of human activity in search of sustenance. Local rangers had issued warnings about increased bear activity, but those warnings went unheeded by a group of 6 friends from Moscow who were seeking adventure in the wilderness. Vladislav Kuznetsov, Anastasia Petrova, Mikhail Sokolov, Nadezhda Orlova, Igor Volkov, and Tatiana Morozova had been planning the trip for months. All in their late 20s, they were avid outdoor enthusiasts who met during their time at university and had remained close despite the demands of their professional lives. This journey was meant to be a long-awaited reunion. The group arrived at their chosen campsite on the afternoon of May 9th. They set up 3 tents in a clearing surrounded by towering trees and began preparing a meal over an open fire. According to later investigations, most of the food was properly secured in bear-resistant containers, but some snacks and cooking utensils were left exposed or inadequately cleaned. The night passed without incident. Vladislav and Anastasia shared one tent, Mikhail and Nadezhda another, and Igor and Tatiana the third. None of them were aware that a large male Ussuri brown bear, estimated to weigh over 350 kilograms, had picked up the scent of food carried on the night breeze. Wildlife experts later theorized that the bear, malnourished after the brutal winter, had been drawn to the site by residual food odors. At approximately 3:40 a.m. on May 10th, the predator approached the campsite. Investigators believe the bear first examined the area where dinner had been prepared before turning its attention to the tents. What followed was reconstructed through physical evidence and the testimony of the sole survivor. The bear attacked the tent occupied by Igor Volkov and Tatiana Morozova, tearing through the fabric with ease. The noise woke the others, but in the confusion and darkness, escaping proved nearly impossible. The bear moved quickly and aggressively between the tents. Mikhail Sokolov and Nadezhda Orlova attempted to flee, but were caught just meters from their tent. Vladislav Kuznetsov pushed Anastasia Petrova out of the back of their tent and attempted to divert the bear's attention using a flashlight. His actions gave her just enough time to escape into the forest, though she sustained deep lacerations to her back and shoulders during the escape. Severely injured and in shock, Anastasia Petrova managed to navigate through the darkness, following the distant sound of a river. For nearly 7 hours, she stumbled through the wilderness, losing blood and battling hypothermia. By extraordinary fortune, she reached a ranger station shortly after daybreak, where stunned staff immediately called for an emergency medical evacuation. When authorities arrived at the campsite later that day, they discovered a scene of unimaginable devastation. All 5 of Anastasia's friends had been killed, their bodies bearing clear evidence of the bear's overwhelming strength. Tracking teams with trained dogs located the animal approximately 4 kilometers from the site. Given the severity of the attack and the bear's demonstrated predatory behavior toward humans, wildlife officials made the decision to euthanize it. A forensic examination confirmed that the bear was a 12-year-old male, severely underweight for its size. It had broken teeth and signs of arthritis, conditions that likely contributed to its weakened state and abnormal aggression toward people. The incident sent shockwaves across the country and prompted federal authorities to introduce sweeping changes to wilderness safety policies. These included mandatory bear safety training for all camping permit holders, stricter regulations on food storage, and expanded ranger patrols during the spring months when bears emerge from hibernation in search of food. Anastasia Petrova spent 3 months recovering in the hospital. After her release, she became an advocate for wildlife conservation and bear safety education. In memory of her lost companions, she established a non-profit organization dedicated to promoting safe coexistence between humans and large predators. The foundation focuses on education and improved wilderness management practices. The attack stands as a somber reminder of nature's unpredictability and power, and of the importance of vigilance and respect when entering the domain of wild animals struggling to survive in increasingly challenging conditions. In the crisp autumn of 2013, a remote wilderness area in the American West was blanketed in golden hues as fall settled across the rugged terrain. Known for its geothermal features and abundant wildlife, this region held one of the densest grizzly bear populations in the contiguous United States. The surrounding ecosystem remained one of the few places where these apex predators had never been completely driven out, making it both a conservation stronghold and a zone of ongoing human-wildlife conflict. Baxter Thornfield and Reed McAllister had been close friends since their college days at Montana State University 2 decades earlier. Both had settled in Bozeman after graduation, Baxter working as a civil engineer, Reed as a high school science teacher. Their annual elk hunting trip had become a cherished tradition, offering a rare chance to disconnect from daily life and reconnect with each other and the wilderness they revered. That year, they secured a highly sought-after late-season elk permit for a rugged zone near the northern boundary of the protected area where limited hunting was allowed under strict regulations. As experienced outdoorsmen, they followed all safety protocols, carrying bear spray on their belts, storing food in certified bear-resistant containers suspended from trees, and processing any harvested game away from camp and downwind. However, an unusually dry summer had severely reduced natural food availability for the region's grizzlies. Park biologists had observed increased bear activity at lower elevations as the animals ranged farther in search of nourishment before hibernation. Some bears had even begun shadowing wolf packs to scavenge their kills, a risky behavior that brought them into closer proximity with humans. Baxter and Reed arrived at their remote campsite on October 29th, setting up their tent in a clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines. They spent the day scouting for elk sign and found promising evidence of a nearby herd. That evening, they cooked a modest meal using a portable stove and discussed their hunting plans before settling into their sleeping bags shortly after sundown. According to Reed's later statement to officials, he was awakened around 4:15 a.m. when Baxter mentioned he was stepping outside to relieve himself. After pulling on his boots and jacket, Baxter exited the tent with a small headlamp. Reed dozed off briefly, only to be jolted awake roughly 10 minutes later by low, guttural growls emanating from the edge of the campsite. When Baxter failed to return after several minutes, Reed called out for him but received no reply. Growing increasingly concerned, he quickly pulled on his boots, grabbed his rifle and flashlight, and stepped out of the tent. Sweeping the area with his light, he caught sight of a massive grizzly bear approximately 30 yards away. The bear was hunched over something on the ground that, with growing dread, Reed realized was his friend's motionless body. The bear immediately reacted to the light and Reed's presence, rising to its full height, estimated later at over 7 feet, and emitting a thunderous roar. Instead of charging, the bear turned back toward Baxter and began dragging the body toward the surrounding forest. Paralyzed by fear and shock, Reed made a decision that would weigh on him for years to come. Rather than attempting to intervene, an action later affirmed by wildlife experts as likely fatal, he scrambled up a nearby pine tree with low-hanging branches. From a height of about 15 feet, he watched helplessly as the grizzly disappeared into the dark tree line, dragging Baxter's body with it. Reed remained in the tree until first light, nearly 3 hours later. Disoriented and traumatized, he descended, gathered only his essential gear, and began a desperate 5-mile hike to the nearest ranger station. Officials from the wilderness area's bear management team, accompanied by armed personnel, responded swiftly to his report. Using trained tracking dogs, the team located Baxter's partially consumed remains about half a mile from the campsite. Nearby, they discovered the carcass of a young elk that the grizzly had likely killed the previous day. Evidence suggested that the bear had been actively feeding when the hunters unknowingly set up camp within its territory. DNA samples confirmed that the bear was a known male, approximately 12 years old, previously tagged as part of an ongoing wildlife monitoring project. Following protocol for fatal attacks exhibiting predatory behavior, officials made the decision to euthanize the bear. The animal was located and removed 2 days later. Investigators concluded that Baxter had likely stumbled into the bear's feeding area in the pre-dawn darkness, unintentionally provoking a defensive attack. However, the bear's subsequent behavior, dragging the body away, was considered indicative of a rare but documented shift from defensive to predatory behavior. Reed McAllister never returned to hunting after the tragedy. In the months that followed, he established the Thornfield Wilderness Safety Foundation in memory of his friend. The foundation focuses on bear safety education and conflict prevention, supporting initiatives such as improved signage, near known feeding zones, and mandatory bear safety training for all backcountry permit holders. The incident reignited debate over hunting practices in grizzly habitats, with conservation groups highlighting the increased risk associated with the presence of blood and carcasses. In response, several jurisdictions in the region introduced new regulations requiring hunters to carry bear spray and adhere to stricter meat storage and transport protocols. 5 years later, Reed published a memoir reflecting on his friendship with Baxter and the events of that ill-fated trip. In its final chapter, he observed that in the timeless interaction between humans and apex predators, people remain guests in a wilderness shaped by forces far older and more powerful than themselves, where even modern tools offer no guarantee of safety. An isolated river in the Kodiak region of Alaska, 2013. Known for its thriving salmon runs and untouched wilderness, the river had long drawn anglers from around the world. Winding through the verdant valleys of the island, its waters had sustained the region's indigenous communities for thousands of years before becoming a renowned destination for sport fishing. The island, often referred to as one of Alaska's natural treasures, was also home to the world's largest subspecies of brown bear, massive creatures with adult males often exceeding 1,500 pounds. Harrison Rutherford, a 42-year-old investment banker from Seattle, had spent years planning his dream fishing trip to Alaska. A seasoned angler with experience in various parts of the American West, he believed himself well prepared for backcountry conditions. However, the rugged Alaskan wilderness would soon reveal just how unprepared he truly was. On the clear morning of September 15th, Rutherford ventured farther downstream than usual, targeting a remote bend in the river recommended by his guide, Emerson Blackwood. The location, known for its exceptional salmon activity, was nearly 3 miles from the nearest outpost, and reachable only via a narrow trail cutting through dense brush. Blackwood had advised caution due to heightened bear activity during the salmon season, but had allowed Rutherford to fish alone after he insisted he was comfortable with the risks. The day began well. Rutherford landed 4 sizable salmon within the first 2 hours. Rather than returning to camp with his catch, he chose to clean the fish on the riverbank, unaware that this decision would have grave consequences. Unlike anglers who clean their catch in moving water to disperse the remains, Rutherford left a trail of blood and entrails on land, creating a potent lure for any nearby predators. Intent on preparing his meal, Rutherford did not notice the bear approaching from downstream. Wildlife officials later estimated the animal's weight at around 1,200 pounds. Drawn by the strong scent of fish remains, the bear silently advanced through the underbrush. It was later determined that Rutherford had been wearing headphones, likely muffling the sound of the animal's approach. Farther upstream, a seasoned guide named Nikolai Petrov, who was instructing 2 clients in fly fishing techniques, spotted the bear first. Realizing the imminent danger, he tried to alert Rutherford by whistling loudly. However, the roar of the river and the distance between them rendered his efforts ineffective. Rutherford only became aware of the bear when it was roughly 20 yards away. According to Petrov's account, Rutherford initially froze, a correct first reaction to a distant bear. But as the bear continued to approach, fear took hold. Rutherford attempted to climb a nearby spruce tree in a desperate bid for safety, a decision that proved disastrous. The bear, interpreting Rutherford's sudden movement as either a threat or the behavior of fleeing prey, charged with startling speed. Before he could climb more than a few feet up the tree, the bear caught his right ankle in its jaws and yanked him to the ground. Its immense power was unmistakable as it hauled the 190-pound man as if he were weightless. The attack that followed was brief, but devastating. The bear delivered multiple crushing bites to Rutherford's abdomen and thigh, inflicting deep puncture wounds and severely damaging muscle tissue. From approximately 200 yards away, Petrov observed the attack unfold and immediately retrieved an emergency flare gun from his pack. He fired a flare toward the bear while instructing his clients to stay back. The sudden burst of light and sound startled the animal, causing it to release Rutherford and retreat a short distance. However, the bear quickly turned back toward its target. Petrov fired a second flare, this one passing closer to the bear's face, which finally caused the animal to retreat into the dense underbrush. Trained as a wilderness paramedic, Petrov rushed to Rutherford's side while directing one of his clients to activate their emergency satellite beacon. Rutherford had lost consciousness from blood loss and shock, his fishing gear soaked with blood from the deep gashes to his lower body. Using supplies from his first aid kit, Petrov applied pressure bandages and administered emergency care that was later credited with saving Rutherford's life. A rescue helicopter arrived approximately 90 minutes later, transporting Rutherford first to a regional hospital and then to a trauma center for specialized treatment. Surgeons worked for over 11 hours to repair the extensive damage to his leg and abdomen. Although his life was saved, Rutherford lost significant muscle function in his right leg and required extensive rehabilitation to regain mobility. Officials from the state's wildlife department investigated the site and found it scattered with fish remains, a clear attractant that one biologist referred to as an open invitation for a bear encounter. The event was later used in public safety campaigns to reinforce proper food handling and cleaning protocols when in bear country. Rutherford later acknowledged that overconfidence and disregard for established safety measures had nearly cost him his life. Through a written statement, he expressed gratitude to Petrov for his life-saving intervention and urged fellow outdoor enthusiasts to treat wilderness safety guidelines with the utmost seriousness. The incident offered a sobering reminder that, while not inherently aggressive toward humans, large bears can become dangerous when they associate people with food. For Rutherford, the lasting physical scars would forever symbolize the power of nature and the respect it commands. In October 2011, the Gallatin Range in Montana stood resplendent in autumn glory, its lower slopes adorned with golden aspen, while early snowfall dusted the higher elevations. Part of a vast and rugged ecosystem, this mountain range formed a critical wildlife corridor between protected wilderness areas to the north. For generations, these mountains had provided premier elk hunting opportunities, drawing sportsmen from across the country to test their skills against the challenging terrain and elusive game. Alistair Montague had been hunting these mountains since childhood. At 42, the fifth-generation Montanan had accumulated decades of backcountry experience across the northern Rockies. A skilled taxidermist by profession, Alistair approached hunting with a reverence born from intimate knowledge of animal anatomy and behavior. He preferred to hunt alone, relishing the solitude and self-reliance that solo expeditions demanded. On October 17th, Alistair set out from the trailhead before dawn, planning a 3-day hunt in a remote basin he had scouted earlier in the season. The weather forecast predicted clear skies, with nighttime temperatures dropping into the teens. Ideal conditions for tracking elk as they moved to lower elevations, seeking food and shelter. By mid-morning on the second day, Alistair's persistence had paid off. He spotted a mature bull elk approximately 250 yards upslope and executed a clean shot that struck the animal's vital organs. The elk ran approximately 80 yards before collapsing in a small meadow bordered by dense pine forest. Following proper hunting protocol, Alistair waited 30 minutes before approaching to ensure the animal had expired humanely. Upon reaching the downed elk, Alistair began the meticulous process of field dressing, removing the internal organs to cool the meat quickly and prevent spoilage. He worked efficiently, using his specialized knives to separate the animal's hide and access the body cavity. So focused was he on his task that he failed to notice the disturbed vegetation and large paw prints at the forest edge, approximately 40 yards away. According to the account Alistair later provided to wildlife officials from his hospital bed, he had just completed the field dressing process when he heard a sudden crashing in the underbrush behind him. Turning, he saw an adult female grizzly bear charging directly toward him from less than 20 yards away. Despite having his rifle propped against a nearby tree, Alistair had no time to reach it before the bear was upon him. The initial impact knocked him face first into the elk carcass. The bear's weight, estimated later at approximately 350 pounds, crushed Alistair's right shoulder and collarbone. He felt the bear's teeth close around his upper arm, the pressure intense enough to splinter the humerus bone. Out of instinct, rather than conscious decision, he rolled into a protective ball, covering his neck and head with his arms. In a fortunate twist that wildlife biologists later identified as critical to his survival, Alistair's hunting rifle, a weatherproof Remington 700 and 300 Winchester Magnum caliber, was positioned between his body and the bear during part of the attack. The sturdy wooden stock partially absorbed several bites that would otherwise have penetrated Alistair's torso. The rifle was later recovered with the stock splintered and bearing distinct tooth impressions. After what Alistair estimated was about 45 seconds of intense mauling, the bear suddenly ceased its attack. Through the haze of shock and pain, he perceived the animal standing over him, huffing and swaying. Behavior experts later interpreted as the grizzly determining whether the threat had been neutralized. After what seemed like an eternity but was likely only moments, the bear turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Alistair bleeding heavily in the alpine meadow. Despite catastrophic injuries, including a shattered right arm, 4 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and deep lacerations to his back, side, and scalp, Alistair maintained consciousness. Drawing on decades of wilderness experience, he knew his survival depended on immediate action. Using his undamaged left hand, he retrieved the emergency medical kit from his pack and applied quick-clot gauze to the most severe wounds. He then secured his mangled right arm against his chest, using his hunting vest as an improvised sling. With extraordinary fortitude, Alistair began the agonizing journey uphill to reach higher ground where his satellite GPS emergency beacon might transmit more effectively. Each step sent waves of pain through his body, and blood loss gradually weakened him. It took nearly 3 hours to cover less than half a mile of terrain. At a small ridgeline clearing, Alistair activated his emergency beacon and collapsed against a boulder. The GPS device transmitted his coordinates to emergency services shortly after 4 p.m. Search and rescue teams mobilized immediately, but deteriorating weather conditions prevented helicopter evacuation until the following morning. Alistair endured a night of sub-freezing temperatures, fading in and out of consciousness as hypothermia compounded his injuries. At dawn, a break in the storm allowed a rescue helicopter to reach his location. First responders found him in critical condition, but still alive, a testament to his wilderness knowledge and sheer determination. At the hospital, trauma surgeons worked for 11 hours to repair the damage to Alistair's arm, chest, and internal organs. Medical staff later remarked that his exceptional physical conditioning and immediate first aid measures were crucial factors in his survival. Even so, his recovery required months of hospitalization and rehabilitation. Doctors salvaged his arm, though with permanently limited function and chronic pain. Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks officials investigated the incident and determined that the grizzly had likely been in the process of claiming the elk carcass when Alistair inadvertently positioned himself between the predator and the food source. DNA samples collected from Alistair's clothing identified the bear as a known sow with 2 yearling cubs, though the cubs were not present during the attack. Following department policy for defensive bear incidents with no history of problematic behavior, officials did not attempt to locate or remove the bear from the wild. When able to speak with investigators, Alistair insisted that he harbored no ill will toward the grizzly, acknowledging that he had entered her territory and that she had behaved according to her nature. His perspective impressed wildlife managers who invited him, once recovered, to participate in hunter education programs focusing on bear safety in grizzly country. 6 months after the attack, with his right arm supported by a complex brace, Alistair appeared before the state legislature to advocate for a bill requiring all backcountry hunters to carry bear spray. His testimony, delivered in a matter-of-fact manner that belied his harrowing experience, helped secure passage of the measure by a narrow margin. Though he never regained full use of his dominant arm, Alistair returned to hunting 2 seasons later, always with a partner, always with bear spray accessible on his hip, and always with a deeper respect for the apex predators with whom he shared the wilderness. The Wind River Range in Wyoming had long been regarded as one of the most breathtaking wilderness regions in the United States, featuring more than 40 peaks over 13,000 feet and a multitude of remote alpine lakes. Stretching over 100 miles, this rugged mountain range attracted an increasing number of backcountry enthusiasts, seeking solitude away from the heavily trafficked destinations nearby. While the area was admired for its raw beauty and challenging terrain, the growing presence of grizzly bears posed a serious concern for hikers venturing deep into its remote valleys. Percival "Percy" Wellington, a 34-year-old software developer from Portland, had spent months preparing for a solo trek across the range. An experienced backpacker with several multi-day excursions under his belt, he brought along all recommended bear safety gear, including a bear-resistant food container and bear spray. However, he lacked practical experience in grizzly territory, having previously hiked primarily in regions inhabited by black bears. On the 4th day of his week-long journey, Wellington had been making steady progress along a high-altitude trail, covering nearly 15 miles through dramatic scenery. The late September weather was unusually cooperative, with clear skies and mild temperatures. Feeling confident in his abilities, he had begun to let his guard down. That afternoon, he paused near a dramatic overlook with sweeping views of the valley below. Although scenic, the spot presented a safety hazard: limited visibility and few viable escape routes. As he unpacked a snack, he failed to notice clear signs of recent bear activity nearby. Scattered rocks, disturbed earth, and fresh scat not far from where he sat. Wellington later recalled first sensing something was wrong when he heard a low, rhythmic huffing sound about 30 yards away. Looking up, he spotted a large grizzly emerging from a dense patch of brush. The animal, estimated by officials to weigh around 600 pounds, appeared initially unaware of Wellington, pawing at the ground for insects or roots. In that moment, Wellington made a critical error. Instead of quietly backing away, he abruptly stood up. The sudden motion startled the bear, which raised its head sharply and briefly stood on its hind legs to assess the situation. Within seconds, it dropped to all fours and charged. Wellington, panicking, hurled his aluminum trekking poles at the animal in a desperate attempt to create a distraction. That impulsive act likely saved his life. The clatter momentarily confused the bear, giving Wellington just enough time to dive into a narrow crevice between 2 large boulders near the cliff edge. Too large to enter the tight space, the grizzly became increasingly agitated, swiping at the rocks and attempting to dig into the gap with its claws. Trapped and nearly immobile, Wellington managed to access the bear spray canister clipped to his belt. As the bear lunged forward, he discharged the spray directly into its face at point-blank range. The effect of the bear spray was immediate, though not entirely effective. The bear recoiled, clearly distressed by the burning in its eyes and nasal passages, but it did not retreat from the area as Wellington had hoped. Instead, it began pacing around the cluster of boulders, occasionally swiping into the crevice with its claws in an attempt to reach him. For nearly 45 minutes, Wellington remained trapped, watching the bear's shadow pass back and forth across the ground and listening to its deep huffing and low growls. Eventually, the bear's interest began to fade. It moved a short distance away and began rubbing its face against a tree, trying to soothe the irritation. Recognizing his chance, Wellington cautiously began extracting himself from the tight space, careful not to make any sudden movements. Despite the pain from his injuries, he backed away slowly, keeping his eyes on the bear and maintaining a calm, deliberate pace. After what Wellington would later describe as the longest 15 minutes of his life, he succeeded in putting a safe distance between himself and the bear. Only then did he stop to assess the extent of his injuries. Deep claw marks across his right shoulder, numerous abrasions and bruises from diving into the rocks, and a sprained ankle sustained during the frantic scramble for cover. Despite his condition, Wellington was still more than 6 miles from the nearest trailhead. With no other option, he began the grueling hike back, making steady progress over the next 5 hours as dusk settled over the mountains. Upon reaching his vehicle, he drove to the nearest medical facility in a nearby town, where he received 23 stitches and additional treatment for his wounds. Officials from the state's wildlife department investigated the site the following day. Their findings corroborated Wellington's account. with clear evidence of the struggle near the rocks and bear tracks surrounding the area. Investigators concluded that the encounter had been a defensive response, a startled animal reacting to an unexpected human presence at close range. No action was taken against the bear, as its behavior was consistent with normal protective instincts. The incident left a lasting impression on Wellington. In later interviews with outdoor publications, he emphasized the importance of situational awareness and preparedness in bear habitat. He began advocating for wilderness safety education, occasionally sharing his experience at events focused on backcountry gear and survival training. The following year, Wellington returned to the same mountain range, this time accompanied by 2 experienced partners, and with a renewed respect for the dangers of remote wilderness travel. He later remarked that the slightest sound of rustling brush now drew his immediate attention, a sharpened instinct that reflected the lessons learned from one of the most harrowing encounters of his life. Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, Russia, May 5, 2025. In the dense forests of a remote Far Eastern island, a quiet war raged between conservation efforts and illegal logging. These ancient woodlands, among the oldest in the hemisphere, had become prime targets for timber traffickers who exploited the region's isolation to funnel rare wood into black markets abroad. That morning, veteran police officer Mikhail Kuznetsov led a team into the wilderness for what was expected to be a routine patrol. With 15 years of experience enforcing wilderness law, he had navigated some of the most remote terrain in the country. This mission was aimed at verifying reports of unauthorized logging activity within a restricted area in the island's northeast. Kuznetsov's unit included 9 members: Sergeants Dmitry Volkov and Yelena Petrova, Corporals Anton Sokolov and Nikolai Baranov, Officers Ivan Morozov, Alexei Popov, Svetlana Orlova, and Fyodor Lebedev, a new recruit only 3 months into service, participating as part of his field training. Recent intelligence suggested that the loggers were using radio signal detectors to monitor law enforcement movements. To minimize the risk of interception, Kuznetsov ordered strict radio silence. All devices were to remain powered off until absolutely necessary. At 7:30, the officers departed in 3 off-road vehicles, navigating unmarked service roads as far as possible before continuing on foot. The morning was typical of early spring, 12 degrees Celsius with light cloud cover and increased wildlife activity due to the early thaw. Unbeknownst to the team, a wildlife advisory had been issued just 30 minutes after their departure. Local biologists had confirmed the sighting of a large female bear with 3 cubs in the same sector the unit was entering. The bear was well known to rangers for her size and defensive behavior when with young. By late morning, the officers had divided into 3 groups to surround what was believed to be a logging camp. The maneuver, intended to isolate suspects, had an unintended consequence. The groups had unknowingly formed a perimeter around the bear's den site. As the eastern team advanced, Lebedev, partnered with Sergeant Petrova, noticed signs of recent animal activity: claw marks on bark, fresh tracks, and scat. He felt a growing unease, but bound by the silence protocol, could not voice his concerns. Just before noon, Officer Morozov, unaware of the den's location, closed to within 10 meters. The bear erupted from her hidden shelter, driven by instinct to protect her cubs. Weighing over 650 kilograms, she charged with lethal force. Morozov had no time to react. The attack was immediate and fatal. The roar of the bear and the sudden screams shattered the silence. Officers nearby heard the commotion but lacked clear direction. Without live communication, the response became fragmented. Some moved toward the noise, others froze or held position in confusion. Kuznetsov and Volkov fired warning shots to scare the bear off, but the sudden gunfire only intensified the animal's panic. Surrounded and perceiving multiple threats, the bear charged again. In minutes, the team was overrun. Her path was erratic but decisive, targeting movement, noise, or anything resembling a threat to her cubs. Petrova instructed Lebedev to stay completely still if the bear came close. He obeyed without hesitation, dropping to the forest floor and remaining motionless, face pressed into moss and mud. For 17 agonizing minutes, he stayed that way, listening to chaos, screams, then silence. When he finally dared to lift his head over an hour later, the forest was still. The bear and her cubs had vanished into the trees. The clearing was littered with the bodies of his comrades. Lebedev, shaken but alive, retrieved a powered-down satellite phone from Kuznetsov's pack and contacted emergency services. It took rescue teams 3 hours to reach the location. By the time they arrived, Lebedev had gathered the fallen into a single clearing using a tarp and lengths of cord from their gear. In the aftermath, the loss of 8 trained officers shocked both the public and enforcement community. Investigations were swift. Analysts determined that the team's communication blackout had prevented them from receiving the wildlife advisory, information that would almost certainly have changed their mission plan or delayed it altogether. Within days, internal protocols were overhauled. Continuous radio contact during all wilderness operations was made mandatory, and wildlife risk briefings became standard procedure for all mission prep. Real-time monitoring of environmental advisories became a non-negotiable part of field planning. A memorial was later installed at department headquarters in Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk. It bears the names of the fallen officers and stands as both a tribute and a reminder. Lebedev, the sole survivor, declined reassignment to administrative duties. Instead, he returned to field operations and eventually took on a leadership role in training new recruits. His instruction now includes a full-day scenario drawn directly from that tragic event, covering not only wilderness survival, but the crucial importance of adaptability, real-time information, and situational awareness. Lebedev would later incorporate the lessons of that day into every aspect of his training curriculum. His sessions emphasized not just tactical discipline and environmental awareness, but the unpredictable nature of the wilderness itself. He taught recruits that not all threats are human, and that in the forest, silence isn't always safety. Sometimes it's a warning you don't hear until it's far too late. Uganik Bay, Kodiak Island, Alaska, 1997. Kodiak Island had long been known as the domain of the world's largest bears. The Alutiiq people had shared the island with these giants for millennia, developing a rich spiritual relationship with the animals they called Takukaak. When Russian fur traders arrived in the 18th century, stories of enormous bears soon spread throughout Europe, drawing hunters and naturalists eager to witness these magnificent predators firsthand. By the late 20th century, Kodiak had become a premier destination for trophy bear hunting, with seasoned guides commanding high fees for their expertise navigating the island's rugged terrain. Bartholomew Bart Hendrickson had been one of those guides. At 52 years old, he was widely regarded as one of the most experienced on the island, with a spotless safety record and a deep understanding of bear behavior. A Wisconsin native and Vietnam veteran, Hendrickson had come to Alaska in search of solitude and purpose. Over the course of 2 decades, he had earned a reputation for leading ethical hunts and instilling in his clients a sense of reverence for the bears they pursued. On the morning of October 11th, Hendrickson was guiding 2 clients, Maxwell Rothschild, a Wall Street executive, and Dr. Sebastian Thornberry, a British surgeon, along the rocky coastline of Uganik Bay on the island's western shore. The group had been hunting for 4 days with limited success. Unseasonably warm weather had altered the bears' usual behavior, keeping them higher in the hills or feeding at unusual hours. That morning, a thick fog had drifted in from the Gulf of Alaska, reducing visibility to less than 30 yards and muffling the sounds of the coastal landscape. Hendrickson, aware of the increased risk posed by such conditions, had taken extra precautions. He moved slowly, often stopping to observe and listen for any signs of nearby bears. The shoreline was strewn with massive driftwood logs and jagged rock formations, creating numerous blind spots, ideal hiding places for a bear foraging on beached marine life exposed by the low tide. According to Rothschild's later statement, Hendrickson had just finished instructing them on how to safely cross the slick, kelp-covered rocks when the incident occurred. The guide had moved a short distance ahead to scout around a large pile of driftwood when a massive Kodiak bear appeared from behind the obstruction. Based on tracks measured later by Alaska Fish and Wildlife officers, the bear was one of the largest recorded in the region, with a front paw print nearly 12 inches wide, indicating a mature male that may have weighed over 1,400 pounds. The bear, likely startled by the sudden appearance of humans at such close range, responded with immediate aggression. It charged with shocking speed, giving Hendrickson no time to unsling his rifle or reach the bear spray canister on his belt. The animal struck him with full force, knocking him to the ground. Rothschild and Thornberry, who had remained about 15 yards behind their guide, stood frozen in place, overwhelmed by the sheer speed and violence of the attack. Recovering his composure, Rothschild raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to frighten the bear away from Hendrickson. The shot echoed across the bay but had little effect. The bear continued its assault, inflicting catastrophic injuries to Hendrickson's torso and neck. Thornberry, remarkably composed given the circumstances, chambered a round in his own rifle and fired a second warning shot. The bear paused briefly, looking up from its victim toward the two hunters, before returning its attention to Hendrickson. It was only after Rothschild fired a third shot, this one striking a rock near the bear's head and sending stone fragments flying, that the animal finally retreated, vanishing into the fog-shrouded undergrowth as swiftly as it had appeared. Rushing to their guide's side, both men immediately recognized the severity of Hendrickson's wounds. Drawing on his medical training, Thornberry attempted to control the bleeding from multiple deep lacerations, while Rothschild used their satellite phone to call for emergency assistance. Despite their best efforts, Hendrickson's injuries proved fatal. He died in Thornberry's arms before the Coast Guard helicopter could arrive, having lost too much blood from a severed femoral artery. The subsequent investigation concluded that the bear had likely been approaching a seal carcass, washed ashore behind the driftwood pile. Officials theorized that the thick fog had prevented both Hendrickson and the bear from detecting each other until they were dangerously close. Tracks indicated that the bear had been moving parallel to the hunter's path, using the driftwood as cover as it neared the carcass. What made the encounter particularly unusual was the bear's persistence. Kodiak bears, while potentially aggressive when surprised, typically retreat once the perceived threat has passed. This bear's refusal to disengage suggested a possible history of prior negative interactions with humans, or strong territorial behavior over a food source that investigators never located. Following Hendrickson's death, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game revised safety protocols for bear guides operating in low-visibility conditions. Among the new rules was a requirement for two-person teams during the periods of heavy fog. A memorial plaque was later installed at the Kodiak Airport, honoring Hendrickson's decades of service to conservation and ethical hunting. For Rothschild and Thornberry, the tragedy forged an unlikely bond. In the months that followed, they established a conservation fund in Hendrickson's name, dedicated to supporting bear research and public safety education. Thornberry, deeply affected by the experience, never hunted again. Rothschild, however, returned to Kodiak 5 years later, guided by Hendrickson's former apprentice, to complete the expedition that had ended so tragically in the mist of Uganik Bay. The incident stood as a solemn reminder that on Kodiak Island, humans remain guests in a land ruled by giants. It was a truth that Bartholomew Hendrickson had understood better than most, and respected until his final day. Porcupine Creek Canyon, nestled deep within the rugged backcountry of southwestern Montana, had been Wesley Thornton's second home for more than 3 decades. At 58, he was a revered figure among the region's outdoor professionals, a traditional hunting guide whose reputation was built on an impeccable safety record, unwavering discipline, and a profound respect for the natural world. Thornton's outfitting company embodied a no-frills ethos grounded in precise knowledge of the high country wilderness, and it was consistently booked years in advance by hunters who valued expertise and reliability above all else. The arrival of autumn transformed the Montana mountains with striking intensity. By late September, golden aspen groves blazed across the valleys, while the first dustings of snow began to cling to shaded ridges and rocky outcrops. For seasoned guides like Thornton, these seasonal markers carried deeper significance than mere beauty. They signaled shifting patterns of wildlife behavior, particularly among the area's increasing population of apex predators, bears, mountain lions, and wolves responding to the encroaching winter and dwindling food sources. Thornton's final client of the season was a 53-year-old orthopedic surgeon from the upper Midwest. Though an experienced hunter with over 20 years pursuing game across the continent, this was his first expedition into wilderness territory, known for large predators. At the trailhead on the first morning, Thornton delivered his customary safety briefing. Without uttering a word aloud, his methodical actions conveyed everything. Careful demonstration of deterrent spray use, rigorous scent control measures, and a strict emphasis on constant vigilance when moving through dense forest or open alpine meadows. It was a tacit understanding. Respect the wilderness, respect its dangers. The first 4 days of the expedition unfolded smoothly. Game signs were abundant, weather conditions favorable, and the client proved both capable and respectful of the environment. On the 5th day, conditions were nearly ideal. Cool air, steady wind, and low cloud cover combined to keep animals active and visible. By mid-morning, the client harvested a mature bull elk in a quiet alpine meadow located roughly 8 miles from their base camp, a remote site chosen for its strategic vantage and relative seclusion. What followed was a physically demanding yet routine task: field dressing the elk and preparing the meat for transport. Thornton approached the work with his characteristic precision, carefully ensuring the meat would cool efficiently by spreading tarps over shaded ground and securing the area from scavengers. Neither man suspected the unseen consequence of their activity. The scent of fresh blood had traveled down the canyon, carried on the crisp wind, and acted as an unintentional signal to a nearby predator. Wildlife officials later determined that a young adult male bear, struggling to prepare for hibernation after an unusually dry summer, had been drawn to the scent. The bear's natural forage had been drastically reduced, and competition from other predators further restricted scavenging opportunities. Faced with scarcity, the animal's behavior grew desperate and uncharacteristic. The first warning of imminent danger came from the horses tethered near the clearing's edge. They shifted uneasily and emitted distressed vocalizations. Thornton immediately recognized the signs, his gaze sweeping the surrounding tree line. Emerging from a dense stand of pines, the bear stepped into view, just over 40 meters away, nostrils flaring as it locked onto the scent. Without hesitation, Thornton moved to place himself between the bear and his client. He drew a revolver he had carried for years, but had never previously needed to use in defense. The bear's posture left no room for doubt. This was no casual investigation. It was a deliberate, aggressive advance. When the bear closed to 20 meters, Thornton fired a warning shot into the ground. The thunderous report echoed through the canyon, yet the animal remained undeterred. Instead, the sound seemed to trigger an escalation. The bear dropped its head and charged with terrifying speed and force. The attack came swiftly, the collision sending Thornton backward, his body pounding the earth beneath the bear's enormous weight. The assault lasted less than 2 minutes, but was brutal beyond measure. Nearby, the client remained frozen, obeying silent commands to stay still despite a primal urge to flee. The sounds of crashing limbs, guttural breaths, and raw violence filled the air. Eventually, the bear tore away a large portion of the elk and vanished into the forest. Thornton, grievously wounded, was still alive. The client's instincts took over. He rushed to his guide's side, immediately attending to deep lacerations across Thornton's torso and neck, a puncture wound in his upper leg, and severe blood loss. Using supplies from their emergency kit, he stabilized the wounds and activated a satellite beacon to summon rescue. Rescue teams arrived just over 90 minutes later. A helicopter touched down nearby and paramedics administered treatment in the field. Thornton remained conscious throughout, even offering a final piece of practical advice rooted in experience before the airlift. Despite the swift response, he succumbed to internal trauma during the flight, passing away before reaching the nearest emergency facility. Wildlife officers tracked and humanely euthanized the bear several days later. DNA analysis confirmed its involvement in the attack. Further examination revealed the animal was severely malnourished and suffering from an infected wound, likely sustained during a previous encounter with hunters. These compounding factors appeared to have driven its abnormal and aggressive behavior. The tragedy sent ripples through outdoor and hunting communities across the region. Although Thornton had acted strictly according to established protocol, his death sparked urgent re-evaluation of field practices. Within 6 months, new regulations took effect in multiple wilderness areas. These included mandatory use of scent-proof storage containers and requirements that all field dressing take place at a safe distance from camps or kill sites. At the remote trailhead where the expedition had begun, a modest bronze plaque now commemorates Wesley Thornton's life. His name became synonymous with integrity, expertise, and a quiet, unwavering reverence for the wild places he loved. In the months following the incident, the surviving client established a non-profit foundation in Thornton's honor. The organization provides safety training, wilderness education, and deterrent equipment to hunters and hikers traveling through predator-inhabited backcountry. Its mission is clear: to equip future travelers with knowledge and tools that foster greater awareness and respect for the complex ecosystems they explore. Wesley Thornton's legacy endures not only in memorials and stories, but in the informed caution carried by those who venture into the same wild spaces, places where awe and danger exist side by side, demanding respect and preparedness from all who enter. A remote park in Montana, 2016. Known as one of the crown jewels of the American wilderness, the park spanned over 1 million acres of pristine forests, alpine meadows, and rugged mountains straddling the Continental Divide. Established in 1910, it had undergone a dramatic ecological recovery over the decades, including the resurgence of its apex predator, the grizzly bear. By 2016, an estimated 300 grizzlies roamed its vast expanse, a symbol of conservation success, but also a growing challenge for wildlife managers striving to balance public access with animal protection. One of the park's most popular hiking routes, the Highline Trail, offered stunning views of glacier-carved terrain while weaving through prime grizzly habitat, an overlap that sometimes led to dangerous confrontations. Malcolm Thatcher, a 41-year-old environmental attorney from Minneapolis, had been preparing for a solo hike through the park for nearly a year. He had completed the required online bear safety course and purchased bear spray as advised, feeling reasonably prepared for backcountry travel. However, what he lacked was real-world experience with grizzly bears, something that nearly cost him his life on the morning of August 17th. Thatcher began his hike at a popular trailhead just after sunrise, aiming to complete the 11-mile trek before the region's usual afternoon thunderstorms. Golden morning light bathed the mountainsides, and wildflowers blanketed the subalpine meadows. As he made his way along the trail, he maintained a steady pace and followed safety protocols by making noise at regular intervals to avoid surprising wildlife. Roughly 3 miles into his journey, the trail curved around a steep hillside dense with huckleberry bushes. It was there he spotted a grizzly bear approximately 50 yards ahead. The bear, later identified by biologists as an adult female, was foraging quietly, unaware of the approaching hiker. According to Thatcher's later report, he made a crucial misjudgment. Instead of retreating to allow the bear more space, he chose to continue forward, believing he could pass without causing alarm. Park rangers would later characterize this choice as overly confident and reflective of a common misconception that wild animals would naturally avoid close encounters with humans. As he advanced, maintaining what he thought was a safe buffer of about 30 yards, the bear suddenly became aware of him. It raised its head and fixed its gaze in his direction. The moment was brief, but unmistakable, an ancient instinctual awareness between two species not meant to meet at close range. Before he could follow the recommended steps for a slow retreat, the grizzly charged. The sheer speed of the attack overwhelmed him. Though he had read that grizzlies could reach speeds over 30 miles per hour, the raw force and momentum caught him completely off guard. He attempted to reach for his bear spray, but the animal was already upon him. With a swipe of its powerful front paw, it knocked him violently to the ground. Thatcher found himself pinned beneath the 400-pound predator, its massive weight compressing his chest and making it difficult to breathe. The bear's hot breath surged across his face as it huffed and growled, agitated but not immediately biting. Wildlife experts would later suggest this behavior aligned more with a defensive response than a predatory one. Fighting through waves of terror, Thatcher recalled the counterintuitive advice from his safety training: remain still and play dead during a defensive encounter. Forcing himself to go limp beneath the animal, he concentrated on slowing his breathing and resisting the primal urge to struggle. The grizzly, seemingly uncertain about the lack of resistance, continued to hold him down. Its claws raked across his chest as it shifted its weight, shredding fabric and tearing into skin. Then, in a moment that would remain seared in his memory, the bear lowered its head and delivered a single, forceful bite that cut across his left cheek, missing his eye by mere centimeters. Realizing the situation could escalate further, Thatcher acted out of desperation. Despite the violence of the attack, he had managed to retain his grip on one of his trekking poles. In a final bid for survival, he thrust the pole upward, jabbing the bear in the throat, a vulnerable spot. The strike startled the animal, causing it to rear back just enough for Thatcher to reach the canister of bear spray clipped to his belt. With unsteady hands, he deployed the spray directly into the grizzly's face. The response was immediate. The bear recoiled, shaking its massive head in visible distress as the burning compound overwhelmed its senses. Though it did not flee outright, the animal backed away and began rubbing its eyes and snout against the ground and surrounding plants, trying to escape the searing irritation. Thatcher took the opportunity to slowly crawl toward a nearby outcropping of rock, keeping his eyes fixed on the bear. The grizzly, still reacting to the spray, made no attempt to follow. Reaching the relative safety of the rocks, he took stock of his condition. Multiple lacerations across his chest and face, possible broken ribs, and extensive bruising from the impact of the initial strike. For nearly 30 minutes, he remained concealed among the rocks, watching the bear slowly recover and eventually wander back toward the huckleberry thicket. It appeared to have lost interest in him entirely. Only when it disappeared from sight did Thatcher begin the painful 3-mile trek back to the trailhead, his pace slow and cautious, each step accompanied by spikes of pain and the ever-present fear of another encounter. Upon reaching the visitor center, he collapsed from exhaustion and trauma, Rangers quickly administered first aid and transported him to a nearby medical facility, where doctors treated his injuries with more than 40 stitches and confirmed 3 cracked ribs. The incident prompted authorities to temporarily close a section of the trail, while wildlife staff conducted a thorough investigation. After analyzing Thatcher's account and evaluating the scene, officials concluded that the grizzly had responded in a typical defensive manner after being startled at close range. No action was taken against the animal, which continued to be monitored as part of the park's ongoing wildlife research program. For Malcolm Thatcher, the experience marked a turning point in his relationship with wilderness travel. In later interviews with outdoor publications, he stressed the difference between carrying bear spray and truly understanding how and when to use it. Motivated by his experience, he began advocating for improved wilderness training, eventually developing a hands-on safety course that included realistic simulations of wildlife encounters. When asked whether he would ever return to the park, he expressed a firm intention to do so, but only with a deeper respect for the land and its inhabitants. His response captured the lasting impact of the experience. While the mountains would remain unchanged, he would move through them with a renewed sense of humility. Lake Gogebic, Michigan, February 3, 2009. In the depths of winter, Michigan's Upper Peninsula becomes a realm of silence and snowdrift. Lake Gogebic, the largest natural inland lake in the region, freezes to a solid sheet of ice by February, thick enough to support vehicles, snowmobiles, and the makeshift villages of ice fishing shelters that appear each year like clockwork. To those who lived here or returned annually, it was a place of solitude, challenge, and seasonal ritual. Thaddeus Kowalczyk, a 36-year-old tradesman from a lakeside town further east, was among the dedicated few who braved this icy expanse each year. Ice fishing wasn't just a pastime for him, it was tradition, solitude, and a brief reprieve from the demands of modern life. He set out alone in early February, as he always did, with a custom-rigged snowmobile, a portable ice shelter, and provisions for a full week on the ice. The winter of 2009 was unforgiving. Temperatures stayed well below -20 degrees Celsius, with frequent wind gusts that made exposed skin sting in seconds. Kowalczyk's shelter, insulated and fitted with a small propane heater, offered relative comfort against the deep freeze. He had set up 2 kilometers from the nearest shoreline, an area known to local anglers for consistent walleye and perch activity. Wildlife experts would later point to the unusual behavior of black bears that winter. With milder mid-season thaws followed by abrupt cold snaps, hibernation patterns were disrupted. Some bears, confused by the erratic climate and struggling with limited food, had resumed wandering despite the deadly cold. Few people considered bears a threat in February, but nature, as it turned out, wasn't following the rules that year. On February 2nd, Kowalczyk had a banner day. 8 keeper walleye and a large northern pike came through the ice. As usual, he cleaned the fish outside and discarded the remains in nearby abandoned holes, thinking little of it. The scent, however, lingered on the wind. By 5 a.m. the next day, the shelter sat in absolute stillness under a sky full of stars. Kowalczyk was half asleep, curled in his sleeping bag, when a faint scraping sound reached his ears, barely audible over the hum of the heater. He ignored it at first, assuming it was snow shifting in the wind, or perhaps frost crystals brushing the fabric walls. The sound grew sharper, more intentional. Then the side flap of the shelter abruptly tore open. Cold air rushed in, along with the unmistakable form of a black bear. It was emaciated and restless, likely drawn by the fish scent and desperate enough to approach even in the biting cold. In the tight space of the shelter, barely 2 meters across, Kowalczyk and the bear found themselves inches apart. The bear hesitated. Its breath curled in white plumes, and its eyes reflected the glow of Kowalczyk's headlamp. Time seemed to stall. Then it moved forward, inch by inch, shoulders squeezing through the gap in the flap. Kowalczyk's hand scrambled through his supply box until he found the emergency marine flare. His fingers, stiff with cold, struggled to strike it. When it finally ignited, the flare bathed the shelter in a harsh red glow, filling it with acrid smoke and a searing light that reflected off the bear's dark coat. The confined space magnified the chaos, the smoke, the light, and the sudden noise. The bear swiped. One paw raked across Kowalczyk's left thigh, slashing through his pants and cutting deep. Pain burst through him like a lightning strike. Fueled by panic and instinct, he kicked with his right foot and waved the burning flare toward the animal's face. The bear flinched and backed out, retreating into the early morning darkness beyond the flap. Knowing this was his only chance, Kowalczyk bolted from the shelter, barefoot and wrapped in a torn sleeping bag. The cold hit him like a hammer. He could feel the numbness setting in almost immediately, but he sprinted across the slick ice toward his snowmobile about 30 meters away. Behind him, the bear returned to the shelter, rummaging through what was left in search of food. Kowalczyk reached the machine, half delirious from pain and cold, and managed to start the engine after 3 attempts. He tore across the frozen lake, heading toward the only place he knew might have help, a small private resort nestled on the western shore. He arrived, shaking and near collapse. The resort owner, a woman in her 60s who lived on site year-round, opened her door to find him bleeding, barefoot, and barely coherent. Her quick thinking, administering basic first aid and calling for emergency services, likely saved his life. He was transported to a regional clinic where he spent 3 days recovering from hypothermia, deep lacerations, and frostbite on both feet. Wildlife officials later located the bear still near the destroyed shelter. It was tranquilized and examined, revealing a fishing lure embedded in its lower jaw, infected and swollen. The injury had likely prevented the animal from eating properly for weeks. After medical treatment, it was relocated to a more suitable habitat farther north. Kowalczyk's physical recovery was swift compared to the mental toll. The memory of waking to see a bear pressing into his shelter lingered, vivid and invasive. He described it later to local reporters not with bravado but with quiet awe, an encounter with something primordial, something ancient and indifferent. He eventually returned to ice fishing the following year, but never again alone. He now carried more than just gear, satellite communications, additional flares, and a new awareness of how quickly routine could collapse into survival. The incident prompted local authorities to revise safety recommendations for winter anglers, particularly in remote areas. New signage, pamphlets, and training emphasized secure waste disposal and the possibility, however remote, of encountering wildlife year-round. For Kowalczyk, the trip that had once been a retreat from life's noise became something else entirely, a testament to resilience and a sobering reminder of the wilderness's capacity for both beauty and danger. Remote airstrip in the Alaskan interior, 2011. The rough-hewn landing strips scattered across Alaska's vast wilderness had long served as lifelines for communities disconnected from the state's limited road system. These utilitarian runways, often little more than gravel clearings, provided essential access for mail delivery, medical evacuations, and supply flights to isolated cabins and settlements. One such airstrip, located along a historic sled dog trail northwest of Anchorage, had supported bush plane traffic since the 1930s. The surrounding terrain, dominated by dense spruce forest, winding rivers, and broad wetlands, was home to abundant wildlife, including thriving populations of moose, wolves, and black bears. Zachariah Zach Obermeyer and Finnegan McAllister, both seasoned bush pilots working for a regional air service, had flown into the airstrip dozens of times over their careers. Obermeyer, 37, had accumulated more than 12,000 flight hours after relocating from Colorado 15 years earlier. McAllister, 42, was a third-generation Alaskan pilot, part of a family that had helped pioneer aviation routes through the state's formidable mountain passes. Between them, they had faced nearly every challenge the Alaskan backcountry could deliver, from sudden whiteout conditions to mechanical failures in temperatures that rendered hydraulic systems inoperable. But neither expected the unusual confrontation awaiting them on the afternoon of May 23rd. That morning, the two men had delivered medical supplies and mail to a small group of year-round residents operating a seasonal roadhouse, catering to sled dog teams and summer visitors. After a brief lunch at the lodge, they returned to the airstrip to prepare for the flight back to Anchorage. The weather was unseasonably warm, with temperatures climbing into the mid-60s, an early harbinger of the mosquito season, which both men noted with mild irritation as they conducted pre-flight checks. According to their later report to state wildlife authorities, Obermeyer had been inspecting the engine while McAllister secured the cargo, when they noticed movement at the tree line about 50 yards away. Expecting perhaps one of the locals, they were surprised when a medium-sized black bear emerged from the forest. While bear sightings were a routine part of life in Alaska, it was uncommon for one to approach an area recently occupied by people. The bear, estimated at around 250 pounds, moved directly toward the aircraft with its head raised, sampling the air. Wildlife officials later concluded that the animal was likely drawn by a mix of aviation fuel fumes and the lingering scent of the pilot's lunch, which had included salmon sandwiches, an irresistible lure for bears newly emerged from winter torpor. Initially, the pilots attempted standard deterrence. They waved their arms and shouted while maintaining a safe distance, hoping the bear would lose interest. When this proved ineffective, McAllister started their service vehicle. A well-worn pickup kept on site, hoping the noise would startle the bear into retreat. But the animal showed no sign of concern, continuing its focused approach. As the situation grew more concerning, Obermeyer retrieved an air horn from the plane's emergency kit and activated it when the bear closed to about 30 yards. The sudden blast gave the bear pause but failed to drive it off. Instead, the animal veered slightly and began inspecting several barrels of aviation fuel stored near a maintenance shed. The bear's attention to the fuel supply was deeply troubling. Both men knew the potential hazard posed by a bear damaging the containers, whether through puncture or accidental ignition. When the bear began pushing the barrels with its snout, McAllister drove the truck toward the animal in a last-ditch effort to chase it away from the area. The maneuver had unintended consequences. Rather than retreat, the bear abruptly turned and charged the tail section of the aircraft, possibly reacting to the noise or perceiving the plane as a rival for food. Obermeyer, who had been standing near the wing, scrambled into the cockpit as the bear circled the aircraft, rising on its hind legs and swatting at the stabilizers. With the animal growing more aggressive, Obermeyer recalled the emergency flare guns stored in their survival kit, while McAllister kept his distance in the vehicle, occasionally honking the horn in another attempt to divert the bear. Obermeyer steadied his nerves and loaded the flare gun, hands trembling only slightly despite the rush of adrenaline. When the bear momentarily wandered away from the aircraft to investigate something on the ground, Obermeyer took advantage of the brief window. Leaning out of the cockpit window, he aimed the flare gun upward and fired. The bright red flare shot into the sky with a sharp hiss, exploding in a cascade of sparks that finally captured the bear's full attention. The unexpected display succeeded where earlier deterrence had failed. The startled animal froze, staring up at the fading sparks before abruptly turning and retreating toward the tree line at a surprisingly quick pace. Wasting no time, both pilots completed an abbreviated set of pre-flight checks and started the engine. Within minutes, they were rolling down the uneven airstrip and lifting into the clear Alaskan sky, both men casting cautious glances at the forest below as they gained altitude. During their radio contact with flight service, they relayed a warning to other pilots planning to use the same airstrip, advising heightened caution due to the recent wildlife encounter. Upon landing back in Anchorage, Obermeyer and McAllister submitted formal reports to their company and the state's Wildlife Management Agency. Wildlife officers were dispatched to investigate the scene, where they found fresh tracks matching the pilot's description and confirmed signs that the bear had been attracted by both the aviation fuel barrels and lingering food odors near the aircraft. As a precaution, officials installed motion-activated noise deterrents at the site and provided updated bear safety training to staff operating in the area. The incident also prompted the Air Service Company to reassess its procedures, particularly regarding food storage in aircraft and backcountry bear awareness for pilots operating in remote locations. For Obermeyer and McAllister, the incident became a frequent topic of conversation among fellow bush pilots, often introduced with a dry observation about how bear encounters had never been part of their flight school curriculum. Beneath the humor, however, was a shared recognition of how narrowly they had avoided a serious situation. Damage to the aircraft or fuel system could have left them stranded in increasingly hazardous conditions. The event served as a stark reminder that in Alaska's wilderness, the boundary between the human world and untamed nature is always fragile. Those who travel there do so on nature's terms, and with no guarantee that the next encounter will unfold as safely.